Yeah. So, you're here, okay.
Yeah. I was trying to find where to let you in.
Oh, sorry.
Someone let you in.
It sounds like, and she said that she would give us the city attorney's information. The bars don't carry additional insurance because it sounds like, but the city also doesn't.
Yeah.
So.
Well, I think that was it. I'm trying to figure out what type of lawsuit that might come up from that. And, you know, if it's on their premises, and, you know, there's something wrong, your regular insurance is going to cover that.
Exactly.
And, if it's on our property, our regular insurance will do it, but we have governmental claims liability protecting to some extent.
Yeah.
So I wasn't quite sure about that. If it's just your own thing that's happening, and you can control the crowd, and you want to make sure they don't go outside of your boundary, that's one thing.
Yeah.
And I know that Galloway talked about when he has a function in the back of his place, that he usually gets additional insurance.
That's right.
That's because it's probably off his regular partition, so it's just an additional area that he wouldn't be insuring otherwise.
Well, they're sponsoring the event, that makes sense, but I understand with open container, no one's really sponsoring it.
I think you're right about that.
Here we see.
Yeah, we're just kind of permitting them to have a larger area.
Okay, yeah, she said blah, 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 blah. According to the town of Butte's attorney, yeah, Butte, Montana, sorry, I was going the first time, Butte.
You did.
Sorry. Their open container policy does not affect their town's insurance at all, either in their ability to get one or in the price. Essentially, if something happened downtown, that the city would be liable for it. The city would be liable for it regardless if the person had been drinking earlier, was drinking at that time, was sober, or any other factors that would be normally considered. Oh, and then she just says, you know, one factor I think is missing from the current language is it start and end and blah, blah, blah. No issues. Okay. But, so I thought that was kind of interesting that they were, so it sounds, and maybe I'm thinking because she talked about Bozeman, but Bozeman is like special event restricted. So like it's only open container during like no art walk or a David Street Station event or versus where it sounds like Butte.
If I might have a minute, Hopkins here. If I might have a minute, I had John draft up an amendment to our open container issue, and I think he sent a copy of it to everybody. And I guess before we consider this at the next regular meeting, I'll be ready for your thoughts. Thank you.
Yeah, Bob, the only thing that I worried about that was that language in there where it required the people to get insurance, that there would be and several liability. I can't imagine that an insurance company would touch that. And I worried if that wasn't a poison pill to the whole idea of doing that. I'd be real curious what the liquor dealers and or any insurers would say about that, because I could picture them looking at that and saying, no, we're not getting into that one.
I might respond to that, Mike. That's exactly the problem with the open container business all over town.
And folks, since we have more than 4 present, we better not discuss this till we get a meeting called to order, if you're okay with that.
Okay.
Thank you much.
Fine.
Well, I don't know. Steve Cathy doesn't look, he looks like he's sitting there, but I think it's just a cardboard cutout.
That's a good story. I think we'll stick with that one. Okay.
does your lighting, Stephen? Looks very good. Did they powder your forehead and stuff?
No, I did not call in my makeup crew today.
Took a break.
Yes. I didn't feel like putting my mask on to be able to let them get close.
Well, my only question is, who the hell are all these old gray-haired, gray-bearded guys that are on here?
I was gonna say, you probably can't see my gray from that far away, so I'm going to opt myself out of that group.
But you heard about the young girl that was talking to her mother and said, "Hey, Mom, I noticed you've got a gray hair." And Mom said, "Well, oh, yes, every time you make me sad, I wind up with a gray hair." And the girl stepped back to gasp. "What did you do to Grandma?"
Hi, Liz, are you up?
Hey, Bob, did you ask if we're on?
I just asked if you were up.
Yes. I are going to be talking litter control early on.
Well, I just wanted to know, I looked at the modifications to the state little
Yeah.
parking lot thing. That's a go for me.
It is. I was pleased that they had found a way to work those parking spaces
Oh, yeah,
out.
that will be a winner for everybody.
And it's not going to hurt the state complex at all.
Well, I noticed there's two drains where we've got a low spot adjacent to our 321's proposed parking lot,
Yes.
and that will take care of the problem for the restaurant too.
The office.
Thank you.
Good evening there.
I'd smile, but you can't tell.
Oh, Charlie's
He
not.
was. I think he just turned his camera off. He's that admin one.
Oh, yeah. All right, are we ready? Okay. It looks like everybody's here, and I apologize, we ran a little bit over in our pre-meeting, so we'll get started with litter control. Mr. City Manager.
Mr. Mayor, members of the council, good evening. It's good to be with you tonight. This item was brought up as a response, if you will, to some questions that council had in regards to the proposed language for the litter control ordinance dealing with construction sites and covering those trash bins while the site was active. The language last week discussed a broad statement as it pertains to the owner or the agent having control of the preventing litter being windborne, I guess generally was the idea, versus the 2-word amendment of simply requiring covers. The question that I recall from the council's discussion last week was, give us your feel as to what implications that type of amendment would have on enforcement efforts and being able to carry this ordinance out for its desired effect. We did get a memo out to you today that gives you some discussion as to what that looks like. We also included pictures and stuff for you to use at your pleasure as you think about this deliberation. And what I'd like to do is just give you a real brief review of that document so that as you go to it later in your continued deliberations for the upcoming readings, you can gather more information or look at that. And if you have other questions, we certainly can follow up with that. But if it's okay with you, Mr. Mayor, if I could defer to Liz to kind of walk us through that response a little bit, entertain any questions that you might have. We recognize that the memo is a little lengthy and you may not have had the chance to go through it like you want. And so if direction is ready to be given tonight, that's great. But if it's not ready either, that's okay too. We won't press you either way. So with that, if I could defer to Director Becker, that'd be great.
Absolutely.
Actually, Mr. Manager and Council, I believe Fleur was going to display it onto the screen. It was for on-screen materials. So they have not received an email, Carter?
Oh, okay. The memo hasn't been given out yet?
No. I was instructed by your office to send it to the clerk's office, and it was to be displayed. And so part of it appears to be on the screen right now.
Your Honor, City Manager?
Yes.
Council did receive all of that material in a packet this afternoon. It went out in the same email that had the link for this meeting. So they have all of these materials I will be showing on screen, and I am happy to go to whatever screen Ms. Becker wants me to navigate to if she needs to explain anything. But Council does have it in their email.
Oh, wonderful. Thank you.
Okay, so, well, Fleur, can we get to the beginning of what's on the screen then? I know we're on page 3 of, okay, there we go. Okay. So, with technology, I think you all should have what we put together from the Community Development Department, and it's the text amendment. And what we've done, beginning with this summary section, is to want to just hit some of the key language in the this first page. In the first paragraph, the highlight is how this came to be with the concerns that Mr. Toops brought up on March 3rd about trash flowing around previously in the Gosfield addition as it was being constructed, and that the direction was to look at a cover, and yet the last sentence, he said the proposed ordinance did not specify the type of cover that would be required. And you're going to see a little bit further in this packet that we have researched multiple different types of covers because specifically the other night, the mesh netting had come up. And so we did decide to get some examples of how the mesh netting can easily be attached to roll-offs. And that's probably the next critical part is discussed. We're not talking about trash dumpsters. We're talking about roll-offs on construction sites. So going back to the first page, again, of the memo, and the second paragraph now, we begin to look at some of the differences between Chapter 8.32 in that second paragraph and being part of what solid waste collection and disposal looks at versus Chapter 8.40, which is where code enforcement begins to look at specifically construction and demolition projects. And so this is the language we began to look at in paragraph 3. And Fleur, can we go to paragraph 3 on the first page again, please? Back to the beginning. Okay. So begin the section that talks about staff seeing several issues with relying on Chapter 8.32, and that was the question that was posed to us last week. Again, Chapter 8.32 is governing the solid waste collection and disposal regulations and not litter control. Again, litter control comes into play with Chapter 8.40. Chapter 8.32 looks at commercial and business containers. It does not provide guidance on construction type containers, which is what we're looking at with roll-off and dump trailers. Construction containers are already covered separately in Chapter 8.40 for this reason. And as we go through here, we say the reasons outlined below, staff feels that this is inadequate and would require additional verbiage be added to Chapter 8.32 that begins to identify the types of containers, because again, it does not identify roll-off and dump trailers, which is where the issues are coming from on construction sites. So on to the next page, page 2, if we can go to that, we begin to get into some of the issues on responsibility and the types of susceptibility with issues identified with Section 8.32. And again, we identify here the issues that we see and the concerns of having plastic bags midway down, trying to get code enforcement to go and peer into trash dumpsters, trash roll-off on construction sites to make certain that windblown trash is bagged and put into these roll-offs. That would require the ladies to go to the construction sites and physically peer in on a nightly basis to make certain that things are being bagged. Again, with these covers that we've outlined, we feel that the least they could do a drive-by, make certain that at the end of the day, the containers are netted down and secured for the evening and before construction would start the next day. I want to begin to jump forward then. So we wanted to talk about the plastic bags not being, I guess, reasonable trying to bag construction debris. And some of those products at the top of page 3 would be how do we bag sheets of plywood, asphalt shingles, foam insulation boards, aluminum siding, carpet, and sheetrock. And then we provided a picture, in fact, of a metal shed that had been constructed and was completely blown up and blown forward. And our officer is here working with a property owner. Our concern is, again, on a construction site, that is going to be something that cannot be bagged, but under Section 8.40 with litter control, we would have the ability to allow, and that's at the bottom of this page, the officer techniques. We could issue a notice of violation. We could allow the offender 5 days to bring the property into compliance. And if not, we do have the ability on page 4 to look at fining for the occurrence. Each situation is different, and again, our officers use discretion on this. So again, from an enforceability standpoint, And litter control 8.40 does give us the expedient way to kind of close a loophole, because construction debris is different than just commercial trash that you would find at a Walmart or at a shopping center, at a food establishment. The construction debris is completely differently defined within Chapter 8.40. Some of the photos, what we've tried to do on the subsequent pages is to look at covers. We did take the opportunity to talk to and poll the City of Casper Contractor and Licensing and Appeals Board. That group felt that they didn't have any issues with saying that containers could be covered at construction sites. We know contractors aren't all going to be thrilled about that, but we did have them weigh in on their support of pushing for some sort of a cover, again, across these large roll-off refuse containers. So we've got some of the pictures up on the screen, page 5. We'll go to the next one. Some of these are what Mr. Toops was talking about with the netting, as well as the tarps. Some of you had talked about whether tarps would be allowed so that we can pull back edges and they can throw the sheetrock in, the shingles, and then loop it up for the evening. These are far more affordable than the $2,500 cost that kept getting thrown around. And again, there's not the liability of having any of these blow back and smash employees in the face. We get to the next one, and we've got some photos here. Again, whether it will go to the next screen. On this next one, as opposed to a roll-off, contractors don't have to rent a roll-off. They can use their own dump trucks and secure that like we see in the first photo. The employees, again, can cinch down the tarps as we do when we take our own loads to the dump, so it does, to the landfill. So it doesn't have to be a commercial component if a contractor can't afford it, or if it's a smaller project on a construction site. We can do the trailers and see, again, they're secured, they have a cover, and it's a net. We get to the next page, a little bit more elaborate examples. And what we did was to really look around the region over the past week as to what other municipalities in this western region are doing. Again, similar weather conditions to us. Some of them are elaborate. Some of them you see in a cage format. But again, the ones that keep coming up in the municipalities that we talk to were simply the net or the tarping. Some of these are much more expensive and extravagant. And then we get to the final page. And again, we know that we have to have these covered when they get ready to be hauled, in fact, to the landfill when they are rolled out from the construction site. But again, the netting would be secure enough to get it away from the site without the debris blowing out as the item is being hauled or the trailer is being hauled down the road. So that was our research over the past week. Again, talking to contractors, other city municipality groups, both code enforcement and building enforcement. There were some jurisdictions that relied on the police department to do enforcement. We're not proposing that. We're still feeling that that can be handled within the building division and code enforcement. But we feel from a litter control standpoint that the verbiage as is gives us the ability to enforce a lot easier than trying to blend in commercial code language. And again, we weighed in with our contractors licensing board. So that's where we are. Craig Collins, who oversees code enforcement, is here with me, and the two of us would be happy to answer questions that you have for us.
Councilman Cathy.
Yes, Ms. Becker, if I understand this right, basically when the original ordinance was written, there in section B, it should not have actually stated there that meets the standards prescribed in chapter 8.32. That was a misnomer and should not have been in other section based on what you're saying. Is that correct?
No, that language is existing already in the ordinance. The only thing that we had added was the with covers.
If I could jump in, this is Craig. What I looked at when I saw 832 is that it covered residential containers and it covered business containers, but it did not give any direction on, there's a loophole, there's missing information, if you will, on construction sites, roll-offs, that type of container. So I'm not sure if that was an omission. They didn't realize that when it was originally drawn up, but if the council wanted to bolster 8.32, I guess that's the other option rather than what we've initially proposed. You could bolster 8.32 to cover those types of containers where it does not now.
Well, as a follow-up, Mr. Mayor.
Good.
So basically then, if we go back to the original ordinance that we were talking about, 11-20, then we probably ought to strike out that part that refers back to 832, because this is dealing with 840, and 832 really doesn't deal with anything that we're trying to address in 840. Is that, that's kind of what I've got out of a lot of what you have said.
You're correct.
You're correct. I would support that.
Yep, staff would agree with you.
Okay. So then as long as your with covers, with covers in such a way as to prevent windblown litter, basically my whole deal in changing this was everybody was in the mode that we had to have big heavy metal, several $1,000 lids, and that isn't what I thought we were trying to mandate, and so that was why it was bothering me when it said with covers. I would be more than willing to change it in some other way that people understand that, as you showed, your netting or tarps or any of that are quite satisfactory. That doesn't have to be some kind of a big metal cover.
We have included in other parts of the municipal code even photographs of the types of illustrations for our code. So that's a possibility too.
That would work as well then.
Councilman,
so if you could say with covers as illustrated in blah, 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 and then have those pictures that you just showed, that would be fine as well.
Councilman Hopkins, and then I'll come back to Councilman Huber.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. I think we've got the solution stares at face. I think Mr. Toops made a pretty good statement here a few weeks ago, and via some emails that solid lids are a problem. They're a safety hazard to the guys that work around them, and tarps are the same way. But netting is really, really cheap, and I think that's probably the answer. And I think all we ask people to do, you got to get a net over it. We've got signs going to our landfill that say your load has to be covered. Well, I know our people are very tolerant going to the landfill. It's a couple of ropes over some tree branches, and in some cases you have a net on it. In some cases people have it covered. But I can tell you, in strong winds, a tarp or a solid cover is a dangerous item to work with. So I think the nets are really the answer, and I think the contractors will do that. It's not difficult. Thank you.
Councilman Huber.
Yeah, Mr. Mayor, maybe I'm the only one, but originally when I understood when we were talking about covers, I figured that would include a tarp, net, or whatever, as long as it was an effective cover. I never had the understanding that we were requiring hard steel iron covers or anything like that. And so, yeah, I want to have so that, you know, netting, tarps, all that kind of thing, whatever the responsible party wants to use is okay as long as it adequately covers it and holds and contains the material. I like the idea of possibly having the photos attached in there. I would caution that if we do that, that there would need to be some fairly well crafted, and I think that Mr. Henley could probably do this, some language in the ordinance that would state that a cover, an example of which would be illustrated by the following photos that are appended to the ordinance. I could see some value in that, but I think there would need to be some fairly well-crafted language saying that it does not have to be one of the things that's photoed, as long those are just examples, and that would help people.
Councilman Bates.
Thank you, Mayor. If anybody gets a chance to go by the bus hub in Park School has a big roll-off, and they have a diamond cover metal diamond cover that swings open, and they just swing it back. And if you just get a chance, come by and take a look at it. It's not netting; it's a metal diamond that you can see through, and it's actually everything that we've been talking about. It looks really good, and it covers the debris that they're taking off the roofing over here. So if you get a chance, come by, take a look at it, see what you guys think about that as well.
Councilman Bates, I think we'll swing by and get a photograph of that. So thank you for the heads up.
And Councilman Bates, if you can check your connection, it's really kind of garbled in here.
Okay, I'll probably sign out, reboot, and I'll be back.
Any other comments or questions? Okay. So direction from us, you need.
Mr. Mayor, if council would like time to review that memo in a little more detail beyond what we offered tonight, that's certainly appropriate, but if council is comfortable with the direction as well, we'd be happy to take that. And that direction, of course, could include leaving the amendment in place or re-amending the ordinance, or at least preparing for that type of an action for next Tuesday evening that would bring with covers as the amended language back into the ordinance being considered.
Anybody have anything, Councilman Huber?
Yeah, Mr. Mayor, I would be in favor of doing what the city manager just said, just amending that back to where it would just say with covers, and then have an appendix with the example photos.
Okay, Councilman Cathy?
I think you need to take the reference to 832 out of the ordinance.
Okay.
That was one of the big parts of Ms. Becker's presentation, was how that 832 really didn't apply to this.
Okay. Any other comments?
Beyond that, I spent way too much time dealing with how a contractor needs to cover containers. It's time to move on.
All right, so the movement that we're talking about now is taking out the reference to 8.32 and then adding in the amendment back in of with covers. Okay. Is it everybody in agreement with that? Okay. Looks like we got a majority. Will do. Okay. Okay. We will move on to open container area. Mr. City Manager.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor, members of the council. Another follow-up item that council requested of staff last week was to bring back some staff perspective, if you will, particularly from a law enforcement view as it relates to not only dealing with the open container area concept from a geographical standpoint, but also from an enforcement standpoint as to how this might be managed as an idea if council wants to move forward with this feature in the ordinances that you're considering for amendment as well. So with that, I asked staff to do some research as well on this matter. The chief has put together some thoughts for your consideration if this idea should continue. And included with that is a proposal as it relates, or I should say options for council to consider as it relates to the geographic boundaries by which this container area might be made available. And so if I could, Mr. Mayor, defer to the chief to walk us through some of those ideas, I'd appreciate that. Chief?
Mayor, council, thanks for the opportunity to pose some recommendations and considerations for you today. According to your instructions last week, I reached out to chiefs of police all across Wyoming and in several of our surrounding states. By far and away, the vast majority that responded to me have similar ordinances that we have in place today that allow for a permitted special event to have open containers. That appears to be the vast majority, the norm across the Mountain West, but certainly across Wyoming. There were a few areas, a few communities that had specific district areas similar to what we're considering today. Those tended to be the larger cities. There were some cities that were wide open. They didn't possess any type of restrictions on open containers. And there were some similar to Green River that have an ongoing open container that's different from ours, but seems to be working for them. If we can go to the next slide, please. So I undertook this this process in an objective manner, trying to understand or believe that I understood the goals of City Council, and that being to see if this open container is an opportunity for business expansion within our downtown and Old Yellowstone district to enhance the livability in Casper. And for those reasons, when I looked at the various options I'm going to give you today, I tried to be as inclusive as I could. I tried to include restaurants that may be wishing to participate in it, in addition to the retailers that are allowed to participate in it. So I tried to look at it as objective and open-minded as I could, and tried to anticipate what would be in the best interest to achieve council's goals. With that in mind, I determined there were 5 areas that I wanted to discuss with you today. The first one would be the particularities of the liquor license concerns. The second one would be the dates and the hours that this would be available. 3, the necessity for having some type of identification, identifying people that are participating in it, wristbands being specific. And then the 4th one was to address the containers of alcohol. And the last one would be something that I would wish you to consider is the safety, security, and the need for additional resources. Next slide, please. In discussing the liquor license concerns, I think it's important for everybody to understand, including all of the retailers and the restaurants that are in the proposed area, that only specific ones have a retail liquor license that allows for off-premise consumption. You have those listed before you. That's the Ribbon Shop, the Gaslight Social, Branding Iron, Urban Bottle, Yellowstone Garage, Office Bar and Grill, Frontier Brewing, and Backwards Distilling. Those are ones that their license allows for them to serve something that then could go mobile out into public. The restaurants that are in this area generally don't have that type of license, and that includes a Himalayan Kitchen, JS Chinese, Don Juan's, Rocca's, House of Sushi, and Eggington's. Now, there may be others in there, and if I've skipped anybody, it was completely unintentional on my part. Next slide. These restaurants would be able to also participate if they chose to do so. However, under the current rules, they would have to obtain either a malt beverage permit or a catering permit to be able to participate in that. Those would be at a cost of $50 per day, going through the normal permitting process that we already have in place. Next slide. So what I'm going to present to you now is my recommendations for you to consider. These are just simply that, recommendations, and I want to entertain any questions that you may have on some of these recommendations. I've already come forward and stated that we really need to, in spirit of what we're trying to accomplish, the Friday before Memorial Day to Labor Day is an appropriate time period that's suitable for our community. But I want to recommend that we kind of start slow at this so that we can learn to identify what the resources we're going to need and what the scope of it's going to become. So when I say start slow, what I would like to recommend is that we consider doing it on Friday and Saturday nights throughout this time period. And then, in addition to that, at the choice of the retailers and those participating, that they choose a Monday night, a Tuesday night, a Thursday night. Some night, perhaps they're wanting to boost traffic and boost sales on a night, and they can all agree on it. So I'm recommending that 3 nights a week during this initial trial period so that I can get a feel for what are the public safety needs, what are the other resources that we're going to need. And then the hours would be from 6 p.m. to midnight. The bars on Friday and Saturday night, they're open till 2 a.m., but that last 2 hours is a different kind of crowd that we just don't want to be policing that crowd, and really the social aspects of it, of the people wanting to wander or go from location to location on foot, is going to greatly diminish, and I choose not to staff that. So I'm recommending that we consider a 6 p.m. to midnight on the days of operation. Next slide, please. I strongly recommend that we consider having wristbands, that all adults who are going to be carrying and possessing alcohol from location to location be identified by those wristbands. The wristband itself indicates that some knowing, intelligent person identified them as an adult, and that they, presumably are safe to be serving alcohol to. I would recommend that those wristbands be color-coded for if it's a Thursday operation, we're using the Thursday wristband. I only say that so that we can mitigate the number of minors attempting to circumvent the system. So there would be a different color for Friday, Saturday, and whatever other night there was. I would recommend that council consider, where do we obtain these wristbands from? And I would recommend that we are the ones that identify this is the appropriate system of wristbands, that we can choose to purchase them and provide them to the retailers, sell them to the retailers at our cost or at a fee to help cover some of the resources that we're going to need to pull this off safely. Or that the retailers can be told, here's the vendor, these are the approved ones, purchase your own wristbands. Next slide, please. The containers, this one's kind of important to me. We want to limit it to plastic cups only. The reason is that in our experience, when things go south on us, when people are consuming alcohol and they get emotional, a glass bottle and a can are easily thrown, and they turn into pretty good projectile weapons or other dangers. They also create broken glass that we don't want in our downtown area. I'm recommending that we have clear plastic cups that are branded, identified as this is what they're for. So rather than, for example, a red picnic cup, something that is specific to this organization. And I'm recommending that those cups come in 2 sizes. One would be a 12-ounce size for your normal drafts and your malt beverages, and the alternatives, the hard lemonades, the wine coolers, and things like that exist out there today. And 8-ounce cups for the servings of wine, which would be a 5-ounce serving, or for a mixed drink that could contain no more than 1.5 ounces of distilled spirit. I would recommend that, again, we strongly consider, we identify these cups and we either supply them at cost or at a small fee to the retailers, but that helps my police officers to identify what's in there. It helps us to mitigate and identify the people that are trying to circumvent the system by adding their own alcohol, their own refreshing their ice cubes and stuff like that. So it kind of helps us know what we're dealing with. Lastly, is the topic that I just don't want to miss the opportunity to bring forward to you. It's my belief that we have a consistent need for a police presence during this activity. What we don't want is for it to get out of hand and start counteracting the good things we're trying to accomplish. And the best way to do that is to have that police presence so that we can keep a community atmosphere about it. So we need to prevent the arrival of outside alcohol from their own vehicles or other sources. We need to reduce the fights and vandalism. We need to reduce the quality of life crimes. For example, we don't want people drifting into the alleys to urinate. The reason why I say fights and vandalism, when people are in our locations now, they exist and they're guests there under circumscribed rules of conduct. And they know if they get out of hand, if things get, if they start getting argumentative with each other, that the establishment tends to frown on that. But once they're outside and they're free of those, it's our collective experience, and many of the chiefs of police also commented on it, that they feel a lot more free to now engage in fights when they're outside of the rules of conduct of being inside an establishment. So I think that law enforcement presence needs to be there. Next slide. So what we don't know is how popular this is going to be, but there are some parallels that I think I can draw with our current Casper Saturday Cruise event that is going on. It's become intensely popular. There's no indications that that's going to slow down. In fact, I think it is going to be a popular event for our citizens throughout the summer. Whether or not there are restrictions on social distancing or not, I think it is something that is going to be very popular. What I don't know is how popular this event will be. And so all of these recommendations are taking a stab at what the staffing would be depending upon an average attendance and a geographic size area that makes sense. For my officers to deal with these people, and it's a great opportunity for my officers to interact with the citizens on a different basis, much more friendly. I envision bike patrol officers and officers just on foot, but I do want to keep them in two-man teams because of the nature of the assignment. But the geographic area pretty much requires that I got to have two teams with two officers in each team. Looking at the cost of that, for an entire summer's worth of those events, it's about $24,000 in an additional cost to the police department to staff that. Also, depending upon the size and success of this program and its growth, which we would hope to see, there may need to be a time where we would need to shut down some of the roadways, much of like what you would see today or this summer during the traditional rock the block. We end up closing down roadways to protect people. If this became highly attended and highly popular, we would need to be looking at some road closures that would involve other departments in the city other than the police department to help us maintain and set that up and take it down. And then the third thing that that may require additional resources is perhaps better litter control and the need for more garbage cans in that area. Next slide, please. So when we looked at some potential recommendations for the scope of the area that we thought you should consider, initially we didn't want, our goal is to try to keep the scope of this as small and contained as we possibly can. Some of the options that I'm presenting to you today for your consideration are designed mostly to avoid some of the problem areas that are going to be difficult for me to provide safety for. So, for example, First Street is completely more problematic to me. The speeds on First Street are completely different from the restricted areas of East 2nd Street. The Casper Rail Run, which we want to support, and the rail trail we want to support and grow and have that become part of the central aspects of our city. We want to support that. For the time being, as we researched it, we're not seeing a lot of foot traffic on night. It's heavily used during the day. But by adding the rail trail into this really extended my ability to to have safe patrol in those areas. This first one that you see shaded in pink generally gets most of the retailers, and it also includes a lot of the main parking areas, but it gets all of those retailers, most of the restaurants, and but the downside is that it includes a lot of open space, a lot of vacant or business areas that are completely unrelated to this. That's problematic, and we would wish to do that. It includes alleys and things like that, or businesses that don't want any part of this. That's a different type of business. So that would be option one. Next slide. Option two, and again, rather than having a big blocky, just squared off geometric shape, these are more inclined with this is what people are going to want to go to. This one includes virtually all of the restaurants in the area and all of the retailers in the area, but it avoids problems like the alleys and the parking structures, the rail trail, and big vacant areas. And so it allows my officers to be able to patrol, to see longer distances, and to be able to avoid a lot of the trouble. But this one includes virtually all of the retailers. It's easier for us to do. It's easier for us to manage. The significant drawback to this would be just educating our public as they get used to, here's the boundaries of this thing. But it makes sense. You know, the Midwest, which has no relevant businesses on it, just is out of the bounds, and so people would intuitively know where these boundaries are. The next option, which I think is important for council to consider, next slide please, is the same one with the addition of, to me it seemed appropriate that we should consider the use of food trucks to augment this event or benefit or add to the success of the event. And this one includes a large parking area that we could use to stage the food trucks in and be as relatively centrally located in the event area as possible. This one is similar to the last one. It includes all of the restaurants, all of the retailers, and also includes that area that, you know, but heretofore I was trying to avoid those large parking lots. They are historically, that's my problem areas, and we just don't want to add to those problems with the intervention or the insertion of open containers into that environment. Next slide. And with that, I open it up for questions. And again, we deferred to council's judgment on this. These are recommendations from the police department.
Councilman Hopkins.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. First of all, I don't really have questions much. I may be offering an amendment later, but quite honestly, the chief has really thought this through. And I just congratulate him on the stuff he's put together here. I reserve the right because I do have some options that we might want to talk about later when we get to the amendments point. But they don't significantly modify what the chief has already told you. Thank you.
I guess I would have two questions, and then I don't know if we can. Oh, there we go. So when you talk, Chief, when you talk about the cost that it would come to run two teams of two officers down there, could we offset those costs? Obviously, in these months, you won't have the officers that are assigned to schools, for instance. Your SROs won't be in the schools. Could we reallocate those to this type of duty? I mean, would that help us out? Because we're obviously going to have more people power, if you will, over the summertime when school's not in session.
Mayor, that's an excellent point, and I appreciate the question. You know, right now what I'm experiencing is a huge uptick. The reality of what has become the Saturday night Casper cruise is drawing all of my resources right now. And so this last weekend we had an opportunity to try to establish a greater adherence to our public safety traffic aspects of it. There was significant impact on that. That was manpower intensive, and I absolutely predicting this is an ongoing thing. It's extremely popular, and now that people are kind of getting a better feel for the appropriate conduct during that, that's going to be drawing away some of my resources on that. So I'm hesitant, although we constantly look for ways to supplant the needs to cover something like this with our existing manpower. You know, what I can't guarantee is that I won't be doing similar, you know, I will already have about all we can handle. So yes, the answer is we'll absolutely look at that. That's part of something that we do every day, trying to minimize our overtime costs. I think this is going to add to some of the stressors of an unusual summer, and especially this first summer where I think there's some pent-up emotion of we've been quarantined for a while, but now that things are relaxing, we're going to go celebrate. So I'm predicting this is going to be a popular thing if council choose to go down this road. So if the two are coinciding with each other, Mayor, I'm hesitant to commit that I won't be needing the additional resources, but we will make every effort to meet those needs with the resources that I have.
Okay. So that was, I guess the first one was my question. The second one is just, I guess, a statement that I'd like to make. And looking at the three options that we have, 1, 2, or 3, looking at 2 or 3, I kind of like to go with 1, and I know it's a bigger area and it's going to take more manpower to cover that area, but what I don't want to see happen is I don't want to see somebody that, you know, has an open container and just happens to cut across the parking lot that is not in this area and they end up buying themselves a citation over that. I'd rather just have the full area itself so that there is no gray area of whether I'm in the right spot or the wrong spot. And I appreciate the reason why you're doing that, but at the same time, I just don't want to create an atmosphere where somebody takes a right when they should have taken a left and they end up getting a citation for it. So that's just a comment I have. Chief.
Mayor, if I can respond to that, I appreciate that. Remember, the officers are going to use discretion, even during the, you know, our dedicated enforcement programs. Our officers are actively using discretion. They're looking for, was this an honest mistake or was this an intentional mistake? I feel compelled to point out the need to separate open containers of alcohols from vehicles. We just don't want them getting in the vehicles and driving away. And if I can take the opportunity to provide a barrier, even if it's an invisible barrier to that, but at least get the conversation going, we can minimize the problems that occur with open containers in vehicles. So I appreciate what you're saying, but we already have a great deal of trust in our officers that they're using discretion, they're using it wisely. There may be times when we may say, perhaps we could have done it differently. But for the vast majority of the time, the officers are using their discretion wisely, and they're looking for, you know, was this an honest mistake or was this intentional?
Sure. And I don't think I'm taking away from the officers. I know that they are using their discretion daily. I'm just saying it would just kind of simplify things in my mind if you had a full area as opposed to streets themselves and leaving some parking spaces to question. So anybody else have any other questions of the chief or comments? Councilman Bates.
Can't hear you, Ken. Nope. Nope.
Still can't hear you. Okay, anybody else have comments or questions? Councilman Hopkins.
Can't hear you, Bob.
Can't hear you, Councilman Hopkins. There you go.
Is that better? Okay. Thank you, Mr. Mayor. As I mentioned earlier, I put together a couple of items that were kind of parallel to what the chief has already said. And I think each of you have gotten a copy of a proposed amendment. But quite honestly, I think the chief and I are headed the same directions. in the amendment, I had 3 conditions to do or 5 conditions to do open containers, and I will add to that now. Everyone in possession of an alcoholic beverage must have available on a hand stamp from each vendor whom they purchased liquor from. Now, the reason I say hand stamp is we've all seen these wristbands, and I have actively seen people at the rodeo and other places and at the event center cutting off the hand stamps and putting tape on them, okay? Cutting off the bands, but a hand stamp is pretty hard to do. You get that on your hand, and it's pretty hard somebody to copy it. Purchase of alcoholic beverages, number 2, would be by credit card only. And I know it's difficult to get into credit card records, but if you have a guy that buys 50 drinks in one night, and he says, well, I've only had one, credit card records will show that. And you can't do that with a debit card. A debit card does not have a name attached to it. It just shows up as a debit on your checking account. The liquor vendor shall have proof of insurance coverage with specific rider agreeing to joint and several liability. Joint and several, yeah, there you go. You can't sell insurance to somebody that has a liquor license that you don't, for packaged liquor license, off-premises sales. It's a specific rider for their license. It's different than what the restaurant licenses have, and from what I understand, from people that have full liquor licenses, to have a rider to sell off-premises is very difficult to get and expensive. And I think they need to have a rider when they buy the wristbands and or a hand stamp. They need to have available a rider for us to look at that they can cover that from an insurance standpoint. The 4th one, liquor vendors shall be tips trained, even if they're serving somewhere out on the street. And we've kind of been down that road before. And I'm saying, liquor, this is slightly different than where the chief was going, even though I really agree with his option 2 if we have to go that way. But liquor vendors shall maintain a manned perimeter barrier for each vendor serving area. That makes absolute sense to me. We've gotten by with this for a long time with people like the folks down here on Center Street, about 4th and Center, Frosties. They put up barriers on parade day. That works pretty darn good. And I'm saying, so anybody that wants to do this, you have to have perimeter barriers with a gate that's manned. If people come in, you're going to be checking IDs and checking for bands. The other one that, and these are 2 additional things, so the thing that I sent out to you guys, limited dates and hours, that's absolutely required, in my opinion, and plastic only, that's also absolutely required. So with that, I'll leave you to do in your beer.
Maybe try Ken again.
Councilman Bates, are you on the line? Okay, anybody else with comments or questions? Good. Vice Mayor.
So I think that, I mean, I love all of the things that the chief is saying, especially restricting it. I know there was a lot of concern from people not wanting it to be, you know, just all hours of the day, especially with the splash pad downtown and small children and things of that nature. So I really like the idea of restricting the hours, especially with ending at midnight, because you always hear the whatever time-old saying of, you know, anything that happens after midnight's typically not of good things. So the one thing I'd say is I'm not comfortable with us restricting it to credit card only. There's actually a lot of things that would probably keep us from doing that, especially, I mean, it's difficult to not legally accept U.S. tender. The other problem with that is, and I think we kind of forget this sometimes, having a debit card or a credit card is a privilege that is not, some people are not eligible for that privilege, whether that be their circumstance, their job, whatever it may be. And so I definitely don't think we should restrict it to credit cards only. But I love the idea of the restricting of the areas. I actually like all 3. And the times was the other big thing for me. So I like it.
Councilman Huber.
Yeah, Mr. Mayor, thank you. I agree with your earlier comments. I like the option number 1 for the geographic area. I think that having that, and I don't like the idea of having it be a checkerboard where people would have to hopscotch around. I certainly appreciate the chief's comments that officers are going to exercise judgment and discretion. But I think if we're going to do this, let's try to set it up in a way that is user-friendly and that kind of works for everybody. I agree with the vice mayor. I don't think that the credit card only thing is a good idea. I'm really concerned about this joint and several liability insurance requirement. I would want to hear from the liquor dealers and what their insurance agents tell them. I wouldn't want that to be a pill that would just kill the practicalness of doing this. And so, those are my comments on that. Thank you.
Okay. Councilman Bates, did you still have a comment?
Can you hear me now?
Yep, we got you.
Okay, perfect. Sorry about that. I just wanted to say that I really liked what McPeters has put out there. Looking over it, I think I have to agree with everything. I like option 3, that included the food trucks, and I think that was awesome to think about them and include them. I get what everybody else was saying. I just want to say I like option 3, and I like everything else about it. So that's where I stand.
Chief McPeters.
Mayor, thank you. I just feel compelled to mention something that I didn't mention earlier. The numbers that I gave you for my anticipated payroll costs of providing protection did not include the weekday in this because I just didn't know what day of the week and what type of coverage, and I anticipated it would be less volume than the Friday and Saturday night. So the numbers that I've given you only include the Friday and Saturday night expenses. I just wanted to clarify.
And then you were recommending that we leave a weekday open for all the retailers to decide. So it could be some event that may take place and they might pick a Wednesday night. It wouldn't have to be set each night or that night each week, correct?
Mayor, thank you for the clarification. Everything that I presented to you today is not to supplant the permitted events that are already going on. So the art walk and things like that, we're accustomed to dealing with those individually. So, as I envisioned this, I would prefer that we called it, Taco Night Tuesday or something. It was routine, so I could schedule it. If they needed something on another night of the week, we already have the provisions in place. We're very much accustomed to it, as are they, to seeking the permits for the unusual ones. I was hoping that I could schedule in advance and be prepared for it.
Councilman Johnson.
I just wanted to say that I agree with the mayor on option 1 for the whole credit card thing. I have a question on what about when it comes to holidays like Memorial Day and things like that? How would this affect that?
I couldn't hear the question.
What was the last question, Councilman Johnson?
How would this work during holidays such as Memorial Days, where the holiday falls on a Monday?
He's asking how this would work on a Monday if the holiday fell on a Monday.
So again, I wasn't trying to get down to the exact nuts and bolts of the cost. I was counting some of those weekends twice to account for the extended days. On a holiday day, obviously I'm going to need the coverage. Those are probably going to be overtime expenses to cover for that, but we want it to be a safe, enjoyable activity for everybody involved. And so the figures I've given you are just rough estimates, that are allowing for some natural coverage occurring with my existing personnel. I tried to kind of round it out and be reasonable with it, but my plans are to allow for these long holiday weekends in their entirety. and the other events that come up as they normally do.
Okay. And Councilman Powell?
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. I just echo some of the comments. I very much appreciate what Chief McPeters has done. I guess I would also go to the third option, although I wonder if we have to open up the entire parking lot if we have a smaller area designated for the food trucks. But I don't know what to say about the insurance and liability issue. I wonder if Mr. Henley has done any thinking about this.
Mr. Henley?
Thank you. We've thought a bit about it, Councilman Powell. I think probably Councilman Huber's idea, particularly with this joint and several idea, that's a little bit of a curveball, I think. The state did away with that, I think back in 1986, 1987, somewhere in there. And so how that would all work, I'm not quite sure. So if we could get someone with some insurance background who could address that, I think that would be a great idea. And hopefully the liquor dealers could go to their insurance companies and find out if that would even be available in a state that doesn't have by statute joint and several liability. And the other thing that we were thinking about was how this would work. At one point we were thinking it was going to be quite expansive, and there could be a lot of ground to be covered, really with no types of barriers. And so there was some concern about liability and whether one liquor dealer may have some liability for something that happened, a significant distance from that operation, and whether that dealer would have insurance coverage. I suspect that they would likely do that, though I'd just as soon not make an opinion about that, and again, just let them work with their own insurance companies and with their own attorneys as to whether or not they needed to get some additional insurance on that. As far as our liability insurance, we would have what we would usually have in any event, and then along with the Governmental Claims Act, so long as we're not engaged in something that would be not a government function. So I think we're probably okay in that regard. At least I can't think of anything right now, as long as we're not kind of leading the charge and distributing liquor and things of that nature.
Councilman Bates.
Thank you, Mayor. Again, if you don't mind me asking the city manager, with the additional costs of officers for this, and with looking at our budget and having to do a few cutbacks, projects and things like that, is it the best idea for us to approve of the amount of money for the officers for this events? Is this event going to bring in enough money for to offset those costs? Have we looked at anything like that regarding this, if you don't mind me asking?
Mr. Mayor.
Mr. Manager.
Thank you, Councilman Bates, for the question. Indeed, the added costs do provide some level of concern for me. You will see here next week, as a matter of fact, the real tightrope we're walking as it relates to trying to make the most out of the receipts that we think we're going to get over the next 12 to 18 months. And so, indeed, the drawback that I see with regard to the proposal is with respect to the cost implications that are being proposed. To further answer your question, Councilman, I don't have a revenue option I can point to that might offset these expenses beyond what we might take from regular sales tax receipts that we all know are going to be low.
Any other questions or comments? Okay. So, thumbs up on moving forward on the recommendation, is that what we're looking for?
As well as, Mr. Mayor, with respect to what option you'd like to see on the geographic side of the discussion.
Okay. So the recommendations that have been made by the chief, I need to get a thumbs up or a thumbs down, and then on the options itself, I guess we can take those one at a time and see what the best option is. So with the recommendations being made, options off to the side, give me a thumbs up or a thumbs down on that. Okay, thumbs up. And then as far as option 1, thumbs up for that. Okay, looks like I got 4. Option number 2. Looks like I got 1 for 2. And option number 3. I got 1, 2, 3, 4. So, okay, so it's between option 1 and option 3.
It might not hurt, I think.
Yeah, let's, yeah, Fleur, if we could put those up one more time and just have everybody look at it. It's down to option, well, we know option 2 is not going to make it, so it's going to be between option 1 and option 3. So let's look at it again, and then we'll try one more time as to, so there's option 1 that's, they're all geographically in the same area. I think we're all stopping at about the same points. This one's just all inclusive of the area itself. And then option 3, option 3 is all inclusive of David Street Station, and then the parking lot down by Rockers, and then the streets on the rest of it. Chief McFeeters.
Mayor, thank you for an additional input into this. I just want to clarify to the council members that the map may be difficult to see. Option 1 does not include all of the restaurants in the area. It's a more condensed one. Option 3 does reach out to the restaurants. My intent was to allow people to eat in a restaurant and then begin to walk or have a restaurant in a destination. So that may figure into your calculations if I need to adjust option 1. So, for example, option 1 doesn't go so far as Himalayan Kitchen, Eggington's, things of that nature.
Sure, okay. So I guess with what the chief's saying, there's a few of the restaurants themselves that are being cut out of that area, but at the same time, they would require, being they're a restaurant, they would require to have a permit or pay for a permit in order to do that. Okay. Councilman Cathy.
Yes, a couple of questions I had. For example, we're talking about this being 6 to midnight. Eggington's is only open breakfast and lunch. Do we know what hours Himalayan Indian cuisine is open? You know, some of that part may become a moot point as far as having to expand if Eggington's and Himalayan Indian aren't open on those evenings. So that's something I think probably ought to check and see as well.
Just really quick, Steve, I looked it up, and their hours typically actually go until 9:30 p.m. at Himalayan Indian Cuisine.
Thank you, Ms. Vice Mayor.
Councilman Hopkins.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. I should point out that restaurant liquor license is a restaurant liquor license. There was never any intent to let them sell retail and take it out of the building. And so I guess that's why I would tend to go now for option 3. Most of these people do have full liquor licenses and some restaurant liquor licenses, but we have before said there's a difference between a restaurant license and a full liquor license. And so I would tend to go for option 3. Thank you.
Okay, so Fleur, if we could take that down so I could see everybody again. And so now that we've seen options 1 and 3 again, we'll go back and vote one more time. So those in favor of option 1, give me a thumbs up. All right, looks like there's 4, and those in favor of option 3? 5. Okay, option 3 it is.
Thank you.
All right. Okay, do we have anything else on that?
No, sir.
All right, thank you, Chief, I appreciate it. Move on to council follow-up. Mr. City Manager, anything from last week that we need to follow up on?
Mr. Mayor, not that I'm aware of.
Okay, anybody on council have anything on follow-up from last week? Councilman Powell?
I just had a question for Chief McFeeters. Do you feel that the situation with the cruises on Saturdays has calmed down a little bit with the police presence? Do you have any lingering concerns about how that has all played out?
Mr. Mayor.
Oh, Chief.
Mayor, Council, you know, we received several emails from our citizens this week thanking us for the increased presence and the reduced problems that were occurring. I think that we're going to have an ongoing presence as the summer arrives, and I think my personal estimation is this is going to continue on. It's going to become a pretty standard routine aspect of life in Casper, and great that our people are getting out and enjoying our community and socializing in an appropriate way when that's appropriate. So I think that the police department was successful in drawing attention to the unlawful conduct. As you see, we made one arrest that was particularly egregious, 108 miles an hour in a 40-mile-an-hour zone. And so we're doing what we can, but you know, that type of conduct was unappreciated and unacceptable, and we're committed to maintaining a presence. But I think that so far so good. I think we've made a statement that we don't want to intrude with the crews. We do want to shut down this dangerous driving that was going on.
Councilman Powell.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Chief, as long as we have you up there, you know, we've seen some reports around the country that when restaurants have opened up, that there's been consistent compliance with the social distancing and 6-foot placement. I know it's hard to monitor all of these situations, but have you heard of any concerns been brought to your attention that we're seeing compliance problems with that? I hope not, and I don't expect that we do, but I'd just like to hear if you have heard any problems.
Mayor,
Chief,
Council, nothing has been brought to my attention. Some of those easements occurred this weekend, and so I was not in town this weekend. So there may have been some minor complaints, but none have been brought to my attention. And heretofore, our businesses have been very compliant. They've been very open-minded when we do contact them to allow us to educate them and inform and gain compliance.
Okay, thank you.
any other comments? Okay, move on to draft budget distribution. Mr. City Manager.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor, members of the council. You may recall from last year our need to distribute a very preliminary budget document in order to maintain our obligations with the statutes. The document that I'm referring to that those of you at home should have received via email is entitled FY 2021 Preliminary Budget. This is in no way meant to be, you know, the budget document that we will work through here over next week. This is simply a very, very brief modicum of insight with regard to what the budget will look like next week. And I would not suggest replaces the budget message that you're going to get or any analysis at all. It is simply the document we need to give you, that we're obligated to give you pursuant to statute. You're going to get much more information over the weekend, much more analysis to go through. Don't rely upon this document as being that piece. But nonetheless, we do need to give it to you and get it in your hands, and certainly as you look through it and have any questions, I'd invite those questions.
Any questions? Okay. We'll move on to downtown parking, garage, capital, and operations. Mr. City Manager.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor, members of the council. This too is really a follow-up item, or maybe a part 3 or 4 type visit that we've had on this particular topic. Director Becker has been putting together information pursuant to this topic that you have asked for and that we have promised to deliver to you. And as you might imagine, part of this deals with the operations that we want to potentially engage moving forward, and certainly as it relates to projects that you had some questions about and that we may need some direction on as well. So if I could, Mr. Mayor, defer to Liz to walk us through this, I would certainly appreciate that.
Okay, Ms. Baker.
Liz, if you're speaking, we cannot hear you. Nor still can we hear you. Mr. Mayor, if it pleases the council, we can certainly move past this item and come back to it, if it's okay with all of you.
Yep.
Sorry about that.
Nope, that's okay. We'll come back to that one here in a few. We'll move on to recycling options. Mr. City Manager.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor, members of the council. The recycling discussion with the public has been very interesting over the last week or more. As you are aware, we did put up an online portal that sought to take survey data, if you will, poll almost, indicating from the community which direction that they would like to see the recycling program go. And as you can imagine, this direction would be really critical for us to understand at this point in time, in that we can, design these directives into the budget. I would also tell you that it isn't absolutely necessary that we get a final direction this evening. We do have time next week that we can dedicate to this topic, additional to tonight if you would like. And of course, that would be very timely as well with regard to putting the budget together as you would see fit. It certainly appears, with regard to the 1,100 responses that we've gotten up until now, that we've been able to go through, at least anyway, both in the form of online surveying, in the form of hard copy, and phone-in type data, that the vast majority is indicating right now to go in the direction of maintaining the recycling depots as we do currently, and opening the MRF to enable us to get to that 0% contamination tolerance, if you will. So with that, Mr. Mayor and members of the council, that would suggest that a rate increase of $1.70 per month per household wouldn't be out of line with regard to what the public is communicating so far. We do have all of these survey options open until the end of until Friday, I should say, in which case we will likely be able to tally that information and be able to give it to you next week in total. But for right now, it appears that the distant first position, if you will, of the public is with regard to maintaining depots and getting the MRF in action.
Mr. Manager, could you also, I guess, could we quantify a number of responses that we've gotten online to this point, and then any other responses we've received otherwise, just to kind of give an idea that it's not just one or two people saying this?
Absolutely, Mr. Mayor, I certainly can. The information that we've collected so far would suggest that 1,002 responses came in online as of 4 o'clock this afternoon. 870 of those were Casper residents. We have also collected 76 phone provided data. Earlier this afternoon, we're only able to get through about 47 of those. We have paper mail-in options, much of which were available through the newspaper over the weekend, and we've received 38 of those. We have not been able to tally or analyze any of those responses. And so, so far we've gotten 61% on the online results that have said, let's choose option 3. 76% of the ones that we've gone through via phone collected data have suggested option 3 as well. And so certainly we have more to go through, but in terms of overall response, 1,100 responses to me is fabulous as you try to get a pulse of what the community would like to see happen.
That's why I like these portals, because we get citizens' input. Mm-hmm. Anybody have any comments or questions on Councilman Huber?
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. I did have a question. When I read this survey, and I think it's option 3 talks about that we would, if we gave up the recycling, we would be losing revenue that we're bringing in from the recycling. Is that revenue a very significant figure? Because I really wondered if people wouldn't read some of those and think, oh, geez, we're making money on this stuff. And I don't recall there being any discussion about how much revenue this recycling, if any, was bringing in.
Mr. Mayor, if I could. Mm-hmm. Councilman Huber, one of the spreadsheets that we sent to you earlier today probably gives us some of that information, and as well as other pieces that you can certainly review at your leisure. But one of the pieces of information in there indicates that the sale of the commodities generates some $62,000, almost $63,000 annually. That is used to offset a series of costs, both including the MRF and the depots, in the neighborhood of almost $600,000. And so while it doesn't obviously generate enough to offset the cost totally, it does bring some to the table in terms of bringing those costs down to some degree. And I should let you know too, we have Ms. Langston here tonight to guide us through any more of the technicalities that question might require as well.
Okay, thank you. Councilman Hopkins.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. I personally would have gone for option 4, but quite honestly, it sounds like the people of the city are more than willing to pay what we estimate now to be $1.70 to keep open the recycling sites and operate the MRF. And I guess I'm okay with that. But I would also like to say that if it takes more than $1.70, I think we should not be bashful in charging more for it. the truth is there's almost no money in anything you recycle unless it's aluminum cans. And that market already is well established, and we have aluminum cans and steel, which we turn around and sell and do make some money on. So if folks in Casper, after we tabulate everything, really want option 3 or the $1.70, as long as $1.70 is not a limit, in for that. Thank you.
Councilman Cathy.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. I guess I have a couple of concerns. We're talking about $1.70 here. Have we finalized, and I just don't remember, have we finalized our water rate, sewer rate, normal trash collection rates for this year to this point? Because I guess I'm concerned about the overall increase in utility bills that we're potentially imposing on our citizens at this point. Because if we're looking at $1.70 here, a couple of bucks there, 3 or 4 here, they don't sound like much individually, but pretty soon you've got a big rate increase to our constituents. And with the way the economy's been and things, I'm not sure we ought to be looking at going there.
Mr. Manager.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Councilman Cathy. Council did approve back in late 19 the rates that were approved, or, excuse me, implemented in January of this year. So we will be coming back to council to kind of review the pro formas of each of the utilities to determine whether or not additional rates need to be incurred moving into the new calendar year. But for now, we should be okay. Unless performance is such that we just simply need to address it on an emergency basis, I don't see us coming back to council prior to the end of the calendar year.
Thank you.
Any other, okay, Councilman Bates?
Thank you, Mayor. I agree with option 3. I'm actually for it. I would like to see better education to the public regarding what is appropriate recycled material. I know that there was the one gal that sent an email out to us all asking how she can get involved with educating the public. I have spoken to her, gave her some ideas, gave her some people to refer to. To my knowledge, she's possibly going to call in next week, but I know she is on board for the education part to get people. If the people got educated and the containers became less contaminated, and so more of it went out instead of going into our landfill, and we see a increase of it actually being recycled, is there a chance that that rate would go down because of that, or would that have to maintain as the additional $1.70 rate?
Mr. Manager.
Mr. Mayor, Councilman Bates, certainly this funding model, if you will, the $1.70, was indeed built on the concept that by using the MRF and the appropriate personnel, we would not have to send bales out that were contaminated. We could come closer to hitting the mark of a 0% contamination rate. And so the prospect of going backwards in terms of the rates is unlikely, because it is a personnel intensive effort to make sure that those contamination rates do not occur. My concern would be that with respect to, you know, decreasing prices that we get from our brokers because commodities are losing their market value and so forth, would actually incur a price increase or other costs for providing the business. But I don't see the possibility of, you know, reducing rates, if you will.
Councilman Powell.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Well, I don't think there's much point in collecting all this public input if we're not going to pay attention to it. I do believe, and I've had a number of conversations with people, that people are being completely unrealistic as far as the likelihood of us achieving 0% contamination. Everyone says, well, I'm very careful, and that's fine. 99% of us are careful, and in that 1% person that, you know, puts the styrofoam in there or the number 6 plastic ruins the entire batch. So, I mean, I think we should go with 3 because that's what people want. But I do think we need to keep this in front of the public as far as the contamination rate and whether we are, in fact, hauling this stuff to the dump. I was taken by Ms. Langston's comment that she believes that number will increase over time rather than decrease. Obviously, we need to have some very serious educational efforts to let people know that these mistakes are very costly to all of us. But I think we should respect what people have said.
Councilman Huber.
Mr. Mayor, my only skepticism about this survey that we've got is I really truly wonder if these people understand what this contamination means. As I understood and took away from our last conversation on this, if there's packaging tape on the cardboard, that cardboard is contaminated then. If there's a shipping label on the cardboard, that is, quote, contaminated and rejected then. And I seriously question if these people that are responding to this survey understand that. And having said these things, I want to say I am 100% in favor of recycling. I have recycled things my entire life. You know, I would like to say that I've been in the vanguard of the people that recycled stuff, and it just, I hate throwing things away because I just abhor waste. But I'm really skeptical if people understand what this contamination business, how that strict that really is. And I don't know if anybody can comment on that any further or not.
Councilman Bates.
I'd actually have to say, with all due respect, I think a lot of the people has understood the contamination. I think that's why they want to keep it, is because they realize we don't want it, but we want to continue to recycle. So we hear what the council is saying regarding the contamination, and I actually believe that more people will be more cautious, especially the more education we can put out there, as much education on recycling and what contaminates it, what doesn't. And I have faith in the general public that did the surveys, will continue to do the surveys up until Friday, that they do comprehend what we're asking for, or else we wouldn't have as many of them saying we want to keep them.
Councilman Hopkins.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. I'm being the engineer. The bottom line is recycling is dependent on whether it's energy efficient. And the bottom line, you can't grind up glass, turn it back into sand, and make glass again, because glass is not, it's just not energy efficient. It's BTUs in versus BTUs out. It's kind of like going on a diet. If you eat more BTUs than you put out, then you're going to get fat. And recycling is no different. The truth is that when it comes to some things in our world, it's cheaper to grow new newspaper trees than it is to pack them to the place to recycle them. First of all, there's no place in Wyoming that does that. We have to pack anything out of state. So you got to remember, we've got a 800 or 300 mile trip one way to a lot of places. But if that's what people want, if they're willing to pay whatever it takes to recycle their cardboard, their glass, their plastics, okay, I'm willing to pay that. But I just want people to understand the energy balance. And the truth is, right now, energy is really cheap. You can drive a truck to Denver for a lot less than what you could have 3 months ago. So if that's what we want to do, whatever the people want to do, I will go that way, but it's just not efficient. Sorry. Thank you.
Vice Mayor Lutz.
Just really quick, I mean, I think it'd be pretty easy, even just for this group alone, to start, get some direction from the department and start putting things out, whether it be social media, just your social group, whatever it may be, as far as like things that are contaminants. I know a while back, and I don't exactly remember when it was, somebody had posted on a pretty popular social media group that like cereal boxes would be accepted as corrugated cardboard, and so that's where you should put them in. But obviously what we're hearing now is that's not the truth. And so I think that, maybe getting some directive to us as far as like what is accepted and what's not contaminated, we as a group probably have a pretty far reaching social circle to get that message out.
And I guess kind of to add to what Vice Mayor just said, I did have some conversations with local recyclers this week, and no loads are going to be clean. I mean, there's still going to be cereal boxes are going to be mixed in the middle of that stuff. It doesn't mean that they get rejected. In fact, they say they have pretty clean loads leaving out of here. So just because now, if you showed up with a bale full of cereal boxes, I'm sure it's not going to be accepted. But just because we have a couple of them in there, and I agree, I think education's the best way. Styrofoam's another big one that's not being taken out of boxes where, take that contaminant out of there and put it back in. The majority of the people that reached out to me do not want to see these depots go away. They want to see the recycle program happen. And if we just educate people on what needs to come off of the boxes or what needs to come off of the product before we put them in there, I think that's going to help out a bunch when it comes to this. So we're still open until Friday, correct, on the portal. So, I really would voice that anybody that's listening to this tonight that does not agree with option 3 and doesn't want to pay, or the other way, that doesn't mind paying and moving forward with this, we need to have people's opinion between now and Friday and make a decision. But it seems to me right now, overwhelmingly, and most of the people that have reached out to me directly, either email or given me a call or on Facebook, have been in favor of paying the extra amount of money to keep these depots open, get the MRF open, and so education is the next big piece that I think we need to hit harder. Anybody else have any comments or questions? Okay, so we just let the portal do its thing until Friday and then go from there? Okay. Okay. So we can come back to the downtown parking garage capital and operations if Ms. Becker's ready.
That'd be great, Mr. Mayor, if we could defer that time to Ms. Becker to work us back through on number 5. I'd appreciate it.
Ms. Becker?
Mayor, she told me that if she couldn't get through, she would come downstairs, so she may be on her way down.
Okay.
Liz, if you can hear us, we can't hear you.
I think I'm dropping everything. Okay, a little rattled, Your Honor, members. Starting last fall, we had started presenting discussions about downtown parking, and the green light's on. I think they can hear me, hopefully. Okay, on downtown parking, a lot of that dealt with enforcement, but we also began to draw attention to the existing parking garage and the work that's been done at the parking garage to incentivize not only merchants to utilize that with their employees, but also our customers to the downtown core. The memo tonight before you is some improvements that we had wanted to bring forward based on prior conversations with you, and also with work with the Downtown Development Authority. And they circulate around 3 areas that have become of interest. One being security cameras, which would be an additional capital upgrade to the parking structure. And again, the parking structure was built in 1980. Most recently, we've updated all the lights. There were 115 new lights added for security and energy efficiency. The security cameras would be a complementary add-on with that. We've been working with bids from Comtronics, which I do have, and looking at the installation of 22 cameras, which would also be put into the blind spots that are currently in the parking structure. We also have done research on the access control equipment system. At my presentation in January, I had discussed what's happening now, and what we've heard from the Downtown Development Authority is that when the parking arms go up, all of us are pushing the button to get the ticket, and if we're already monthly payees, we're just dropping the tickets, or they get jammed and proceed to spit out. So we've worked with the actual company that has recently upgraded the arms and worked on the ticket machine, which is Falcon Eye. And with the information from Falcon Eye, who again has done a very, very good job with the system that we currently have, they have gone out and done some estimates for us on, again, putting in new arms at both entrances on Center Street and on Wolcott Street. But as my memo goes on to state, what we're looking at with these access control systems is what we see in pretty much even at airport type installations, where you're using potentially a card or possibly an apartment complex. The monthly users have access cards, employees have access cards, so we're not having to generate the extra tickets. That's cutting down on time as well as the expense of the tickets. We who might want to come in on hourly would get a ticket, but we're also able to still use the validation if in fact that is honored by downtown merchants. We had talked about that back in January too, and I know the DDA very much works to get the validation program up to speed. So with the access control system, of really doing some research on that, the cost was not too prohibitive, I did not believe, after looking into this and working with that particular company. For the access control units, the 2 of those to be the card readers, the access cards and the new gates, we would be looking at an expense of $8,000 as far as a capital upgrade. Finally, there was comments generated by council about the signage getting to the parking structure for our guests, as well as just helping promote it within the downtown core. Again, we want to get people not necessarily using all the parking on street, but again, to get our revenues up within the parking structure itself. So looking at some cost estimates for new sign installation with lighting, again, we're looking at approximately an estimate of about $30,000 and working with the sign contractors, and that was some work that we had done in partnership with the DDA. I have that the proposed improvements with the security cameras, access control, and then the signage would enhance the customer experience and provide for the health and safety of our community members, continue to make the garage more inviting as a parking option. Right now, we attempt to try to break even each year with the costs on that, and we'll be talking about that with our budget discussions. But again, with council's direction, which is what I'm seeking this evening, we would work on the final designs, formal bids, and contracts. We also have a meeting tomorrow with the Downtown Development Authority. The RFP for contract management of the garage is going out this weekend as scheduled. And so we are at a point now of wanting to make some additional upgrades to the structure that as a valuable city asset. In working on the RFP and calculating the improvements we've made since 1980, we are right at over $1 million with that, and that's before this. That does include the downtown restrooms. I did factor that into the upgrades that we've done, but we have made an investment, and for your information, the market value on the parking structure downtown right now is just over $2 million in its valuation. So that's what we're looking at. And so currently with the parking fund that we have, we're sitting at about $385,000 that I had gotten that information from Mr. Pitlick. And as you can do the math on this, we're sitting about a $90,000 improvement. So we've, again, been working with different vendors and getting some, I think, some very solid estimates to try to bring, again, our structure into just, again, a better customer experience. So that is where I'm looking for some capital considerations as we are in the budget season. And I'd happy to entertain any questions, since I can
Vice Mayor Lutz.
hear you and see you.
Just to be clear, because obviously everything we talk about going forward is going to be a concern money-wise. When you say there's 385 in the parking fund, you mean like $385,000 that's essentially available?
Yes, and this is in the parking reserve fund, and that money has again been accumulated for the enhancements to the parking structure.
Perfect. So I just wanted to make a clarification before somebody was like bringing up the fact that, you know, we're going to be having decreased revenues. These funds are already set aside. They can't be used for things like general fund expenses. They are specifically for this purpose, and they can't be allocated elsewhere.
Your Honor, yes.
Any other Councilman Powell?
Thank you, Honor. Liz, it's been a little while, but when we were trying to get the David Street Station project going, there was some talk about trying to link the station with the garage more effectively and create a walkway that would be inviting to people, and then some public education that, you know, that the garage is only a block away. But I've never really seen any evidence that people are using the garage when they attend events at the station. Has there been any talk about trying to follow up on that and make the garage a better option for people when they come downtown for events?
Your Honor, and members of council, and Councilman Powell, I know that the DDA in their monthly board meetings has talked about trying to do something to that alley corridor. That has been something that they've discussed that would connect David Street over to Center Street. Again, the current usage of the parking garage, according to the DDA, has been right at 80%, so we do have room for improvement to try to stimulate that with the with David Street Station events. So I think, again, a lot of this that we've talked about this evening would be another partnership to try to encourage the use there. And it is going to have to take some marketing, not just signage, not just bright lights, but actually encouragement to utilize that for events at the David Street Station. We'll be talking about it tomorrow at the board meeting too.
Councilman Hopkins.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. With the use rate of the parking lot at 80%, I think it's kind of busted that people don't use the parking lot. Our hotels would kill for an 80% occupancy rate today. Thank you.
Councilman Cathy.
I know Vice Mayor made the comment about that money being set aside for the parking structure, but isn't it true that if we so elected, we could actually transfer those funds to another account? This would be a question probably for the city manager or our financial manager.
Mr. City Manager.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Councilman Cathy, I do believe that that there is a provision that would allow council to move money around and so forth in the various funds and whatnot. But I'd be hard pressed to really recommend that as a means or methods to dealing with our budget issues. And I would certainly say that with the parking reserve, that probably is more sacrosanct than most.
Councilman Pacheco.
Yeah, I was just going to reiterate what you just said, Carter, because I think that it's important, exactly what Kristen said, because, well, I'm sure that somewhere along the line on social media or somewhere somebody's going to sit and say, well, blah, blah, blah. But I absolutely agree with that these funds are utilized for this parking garage. We need to stay, have fidelity with that and use that funding for it. I know there were going to be some far-right conservatives are going to say, yeah, don't do it, fiscal conservatives in that sense. But I think we need to stay fidelity to that and utilize it for that.
Councilman Cathy.
Yeah, I just wanted to clarify that I'm not advocating to spend it someplace else, but I didn't want people to get the idea either that, you know, there's no way in the world that you can touch that money. Depending on how bad our sales tax hits and things, that money could be used someplace else. And I don't want people to think that I am necessarily at this time advocating that, but just trying to clarify what Vice Mayor Lutz had said.
Councilman Huber, and then I'll come back to you, Councilman Hopkins.
Thank you, sir. Yeah, Mr. Mayor, I would just like to agree with everything that Councilman Cathy just said. You know, we're heading in for some really, really bad financial times. I don't like being a doomsayer or anything like that, but I think that we're going to be confronted with some financial challenges, and we're going to have to look in every single account, under every single stone, under every single plank, board, any place where there's any money set aside. And I think we're going to be called upon to make some really challenging decisions about this. And unfortunately, part of that might be that we might have to consider looking at some of these various set-aside accounts rather than just closing down city government and sacrificing important governmental functions, because we're just headed for some tough economic times, money-wise, I'm afraid.
Councilman Hopkins.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. I tend to agree with our other two councilmen here. We have already spent the capital on that garage. We have, I don't remember the number of parking spots, but it's really significant for downtown Casper. And to not spend capital on maintaining those parking spots would be a mistake, simply because we can't, if you wanted to tear it down and replace it, that would cost you a hugely amount of more money than where we're going now. So let's just keep it up. This is a good asset for downtown Casper. And I'm not usually a big fan of parking garage unless I'm in a big city, but doggone it, we've got a couple here, and we need to take care of them, especially when one of them belongs to the people of Casper. So to not spend the money would be really, really short-sighted. Thank you.
Councilman Bates, did you have something?
Thank you. If you don't mind me, Mayor, asking the city manager, Carter, we talked about and Liz, if you can chime in too, we talked about the signage, and I wasn't talking about the signage of advertising for the parking garage. At one point, I was talking about the signage that tells you the times, the prices, the blue signs that have duct tape telling you what one of the time frame is, and replacing those signs. Is that a part of that, or has that been discussed? Carter, you mentioned that you were going to go down and take a look at that. Was that ever taken place?
Your Honor, yes, that is a part of this, and we did discuss that immediately with the DDA as well as our in-house sign team here with the city to make those upgrades. However, the entrance signs and exit signs into the structure had been previously discussed as a deterrent, given all of the wayfinding that we're trying to do to get people into the downtown. Just taking a look at the signage that currently exists, it is dated, it is not at all lit, so it is very difficult to see that at night.
Any other questions or comments? Okay, so you're needing a thumbs up or thumbs down for moving forward on expenditure on this?
Mr. Mayor, that would be correct, and it will dovetail nicely, very, very nicely to the next item that we have to talk about as well.
Okay, so we're looking for a thumbs up or thumbs down on moving forward on this item. Looks like we got majority of thumbs up. Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Sorry for the issues.
You need a break? Yeah, sure. Okay, we're gonna take a real quick 5-minute break, 3-minute break, and we'll come right back, so. Yeah. I wrote it down. Start tallying them.
Assuming that everything remains what I expect it to be, I will be on 2 Tuesdays in August. We're gonna go to Hawaii, assuming we can go. Strong. Yeah, well, because we'll literally leave like Tuesday night to get down to Denver and then come back like the following Wednesday night. Glasses and stuff like that. Quick question. Unrelated to city council. Is untitled legal? Legal for the computer?
Gambling is illegal in the state of Wyoming.
Correct.
Felony gambling rises to, the purveyor of weapons. So if there's unlawful thing is not a California mistake, then we can't go after them, but the participant could be charged. Now, is that something that I'm wasting resources on? The answer is no. If there's a complaint comes in or something from the
Sorry, what? I think so, let me look at it.
It's in there. The only exceptions are original historical architects. And that's it, unless I find the book. So I just need to sign it. It is, it's notoriously hard to police. So, I appreciate your ethics of, I don't want to deal with that. Well, sure, let me ask you, where is your release prepared? A little bit, yeah. I don't know, I'd have to ask, but as far as I know. Well, we're talking ATV. Okay, yeah. ATVs, so he may not even know, or care, but. Well, we did our DNA, the little test that would tell you like your heritage. Especially like my dad biological father passed away when we were young, and so my dad doesn't know a ton about like his genealogy. But no, we haven't tracked like the people part of that, but I know, I don't remember what his were. His were pretty, like, I mean, like very like European based, and it's funny because Boots is very like German, because it has like the two dots over the U. Yeah, Switzerland, even Belgium, and France. But yeah, I think he had like a little bit of Ireland and Scotland, not a lot, but a little bit. Yeah. Well, I was just curious, I do it as a hobby. Documented, the birth certificates. Yeah. Stuff like that, 18,000. So eventually I run into everybody's life. Sure. Right, the 7th degree. Yeah. But these are like your husband would be like a third cousin. Something like that. Yeah. Yeah, no, that's something that we've talked a lot about looking into, if nothing else, like just to tell our kids about or like explore with them. But so we got the DNA test. We wanted to do more. I was finishing up my master's degree, so it's been involved, but I finished last week. So
Yeah, I appreciate it. We got some
sometimes
notes
it's
upstairs.
if you're ever curious, I'm actually really good at this.
Yeah, just so Ron knows. It's still being broadcast.
Yeah.
Usually it takes me about 5 minutes, and I can give you, that's why you know, your grade book has and your sheet of kids.
Yeah. Well, what do you use? Yeah. I don't remember the Facebook directory because I want to say it's like ancestry.com.
Oh, that's something I can work with.
Yeah.
Well, good. So if you're ever curious, I would volunteer.
Oh yeah, we'll keep in touch with it. That's something that we both are very intrigued by.
One time I was downtown there, so the one restaurant that was a liquor license to sell with the taxes, is that been squared?
That is a good question. Let me ask.
Okay.
I'll ask right now.
Yeah, I was just curious if that's been taken care of.
Can find out.
Yeah, just curious if we get up there and stuff squared. Yeah.
As you come back, if you could turn your cameras on for me so I know that when everybody's back in.
Hi, Mike, are you there? I think I'm here. Okay, well, I just went and installed one new nuclear-powered battery in my ear, so my left ear is working better now.
Oh, good, yeah, yeah. I just have the volume turned up high.
Did you reach out to the guy that we want to run for board? If Gabby's
I haven't.
we probably need to ask. Maybe I'll shoot him like an email.
Yeah, I have.
Maybe.
I'm just a little behind, not too bad. like an hour.
Man, lots of trouble.
Yeah. the restroom. Down one.
Ray, I like the mood lighting that you have in your background there. That's really classic.
So I roll, Mike. I've got my cognac over here too, so.
Well, I already finished my diet root beer, so.
Ray, you don't have mirrors on the ceiling or anything, do you?
Not that I'm aware of, Bob.
So, see, we got all but 2 back. Okay, Ken's back. Sean, are you back or? Okay, good. All right, we can move on. All right, we'll move on to capital budget review. Mr. City Manager.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor, members of the council. The next 2 items are really hard to talk about without talking about them almost in a dovetail fashion, because the reality is both the capital agenda for the city, in large part anyway, and the funding for social service agencies come from the same pot of money, and that's the 1 cent 16 funding that council has spent a lot of time on here in the past several months. Much of council's concern that I've heard over the last several weeks or whatever, since the economic conditions we were forced to manage have come upon us, is around the issues pertaining to capital and what our capital agenda is and so on. And so we put a lot of work in the last several days to bring to you a proposal that upends what it is that we got your approval on prior to pandemic conditions, and offer you a new direction to take here, and in a lot of ways a significantly reduced agenda for the fiscal year 21. We do have time next week as well that we could use to go over this further if we need to. So I hope council doesn't feel like we're trying to twist your arm tonight into a final ironclad decision. We anticipated that a number of these budget-related conversations will need to spill over into the next week. And so please be mindful of that flexibility. The condition that exists for us now, as it relates to making a budget from a capital standpoint, as well as making a budget from an operational standpoint, forces us into the position of trying to take a bit of a crystal ball method in regards to projecting or predicting what we think our revenue stream is going to be over the next year. For the operations of our organization, we really can't get away from that too far. We have to make projections. We have to be as scientific as possible with respect to trying to understand what that data is going to look like, and so on. I would suggest to you, however, that from a capital standpoint, we don't really have to do that. We can base a capital agenda with regard to dollars that we have on hand versus trying to predict what it is that we think we can do over the next year, which has much more significant importance in times like this, where we are all really flying blind as it relates to what we really think we're going to get in the form of revenue coming up over the next year. So my proposal with capital is this. I am suggesting taking the next 12 months to do projects based on dollars that we actually have on hand, that we have collected in the collective pockets of the city, if you will, instead of trying to set a projected budget in regards to dollars we think we'll get over the next 12 months. The problem is that in a transition year of moving to that type of a paradigm, we are going to have a much shorter, much more abbreviated capital agenda than we typically do. So for example, with respect to what I'm proposing, we anticipate having a capital agenda of roughly $16 million compared to what we typically do, which can be in the range of $30 to $50 million depending on the year. So the reality is, moving to a paradigm like this certainly puts us on sound fiscal planning footing, moving forward. But it is a year of pain, if you will, as it relates to trying to do projects with money that we can scrape together. As it relates to 1 cent 16, we anticipate that the dollars that we have on hand that could be used for capital projects is in the neighborhood of $9.4 million. That is significantly less than the 14.4 we had originally requested your blessing with for the capital agenda. We talked to you back in, I want to say, late February, very early March. That has forced staff to really concentrate on its priorities for the next 12 months and focus on what projects we can get away with in terms of trying to get complete with the modicum of money that we've scraped together in the coffers of the city. So the list that we have presented to you in the spreadsheet that is multicolored and so on, and we gave you a bunch of spreadsheets. I apologize for that. We tried to cut this in a variety of different ways to provide a variety of different analyses, but the sheet that I'm looking at is, like I said, a multicolored spreadsheet, deals primarily with fiscal year 21. The top right-hand corner, would be original fiscal year entitled, and it goes all the way across to reduced budget. This is a 1% 16 analysis of what we think we can do, what we think are our highest priorities for fiscal year 21, and using only dollars that we have on hand. It requires us to do zero projections as it relates to dollars coming into the organization. With this approach, we have reduced our budgetary, our capital ask by 60%. And so we are basically presenting to you a 40% of budget request of what we originally anticipated would be available to us, if you will, for project work. And with that, you can rely upon the fact that with that reduced, smaller, focused budget, we are really focusing on projects that we simply don't think we can get away with not doing for another year. A lot of this is driven by priorities that we think you have, and of course we would like your direction accordingly, but it also takes into account projects that we just have to get done and can't really get around for another year. The reason I bring this up kind of in hand with respect to the social service agencies, we have asked the social service agencies to consider a 20% discount with respect to what it is that we think we can provide in 1 cent funding from an operational standpoint alone. From a capital standpoint, for those projects that they haven't started yet, because as you know, some of the social service entities requested both operational funding as well as capital funding, or in some cases only capital funding. We are trying to apply a cash on hand basis for them as well. So we've asked for a 20% decrease in regards to what they're looking for from an operational standpoint starting July 1, and we are trying to offer project-based funding for projects that haven't started with respect to cash on hand versus what we think we will project to get over the next fiscal year. If I could turn then to the projects that we'd like to complete over the next fiscal year, again on a 60% discounted basis, a couple of projects come to mind that we think we just got to move forward with. Fleet is a big deal for our public safety departments, as you can imagine. We are asking that fire engine number 3 be purchased and or replaced to the tune of $600,000, which is obviously a big spend, but we believe a very important critical spend. We would also suggest along those lines that police vehicles for the patrol division primarily be considered for rotation. That too is a big number. That's in the neighborhood of $950,000 of that 8.7 million in 1 cent 16 funds that we have on hand. We are also requesting that the Poplar and First Street Enhancements project continue forward. You'll recall that our commitment to that is twofold, one of which being dollars through the 1 cent fund in the amount of $400,000 to keep up with our responsibilities and obligations for context-sensitive amenities. And you'll remember that the agreement that we entered into with YDOT keeps us in that funding, but it also includes just over $1 million with respect to utility dollars. That music was not on purpose, I promise.
It's whoever caller 3 is. Somebody in the city put us on hold.
We're trying to deal with that. Thank you. There we go. While effective from a mood standpoint, it's rather distracting. I apologize. So anyway, the Poplar Street project is we're suggesting should continue. We do also suggest that Industrial Avenue as a major project continue. We are suggesting that the Goodstein parking lot project continue, given our new contractual relationship with the state. You can see on the list here a number of things that were previously funded and are not being funded right now. I would tell you that one of the major projects that we're not comfortable proceeding with, that is a big one, is the City Hall remodel. While we believe still very highly in the security measures that the improvements would help to mitigate, and the ADA issues and the operational issues and so on, that number is so big, we really would feel comfortable taking on the balance of that project when we have, dollars kind of coming back into a rebound recovery situation. So, Mr. Mayor, members of the council, we'd be pleased to answer any questions that you have at all. Like I said, from the capital standpoint, we gave you a bunch of spreadsheets. A lot of them say the same thing, albeit in a different manner. I want to reiterate that whatever it is that we're proposing to you right now are projects that are only being done by virtue of dollars that we have on hand. We are not betting on the come with a single project as it relates to capital dollars. And accordingly, we have dropped precipitously with respect to the amount of dollars and the amount of projects that we think we can complete.
Mr. Manager, I'd have a question then. If we're doing it on dollars that we have on hand, is that going to change as more money comes in then? Or are we just banking on what we have now and recover with what comes in?
Mr. Mayor, what that means is when we come to you at this time next year, whether we have collected $10 million in 1 cent funds or $100 in 1 cent funds, we will know what we have on hand because we will have waited a year, if you will. We will have put projections and that activity off for a year, and we will only ask you for what it is that we've collected over the next 12 months. Did that answer your question? Okay.
Councilman Hopkins.
Thank you, Mr. City Manager. This really coincides with where I'm thinking that we're coming from. Being an old retired guy, I'm thinking, okay, you only spend what you have actually coming in. And I think you've done a really good job of doing that. And I concur with all of your recommendations. The bottom line is that we're going to only spend the money that we know we've got in our pocket. And we're going to sit back and watch the world go by for a little bit. But the bottom line is, in the real world, we have lost 2.5 months of 2020 in productivity. And that doesn't even count the issues in the oil field. So that really is 21% of what our potential income may be. So next year may be a more painful year. But all I can say is that what your proposals are doing is saying, let's only spend what we really got money to cover, and then we'll figure out next year, and it will work out okay. I'm personally confident that the economy is going to recover faster than we think, with the exception of the oil industry, but that's kind of out of our control. Steve, you can talk about that. But anyway, I absolutely support your position. Thank you.
Councilman Cathy?
Yes, I had a question, a couple of questions. You had mentioned about the City Hall renovations being postponed, but I noticed down there we still have $450,000 allocated to City Hall safety renovation. Is that still going to be spent, or were we not going to do the rest, or how does that play into there?
Mr. Manager?
Thank you, Mr. Mayor, Councilman Cathy. You've hit the nail on the head there. We are putting off the rest of that project, which, as you recall, exceeded $2 million left in construction activity. The figure that you see there is the design piece of that project, and it's the piece of the project that we've already entered into contract to complete. And so I didn't really feel it appropriate to try to break that contract and go through the hassle of dealing with a contractor that we've already hired, basically, and tell them we're not hiring them anymore to complete this portion of the project. So that will be all that will be completed on the City Hall side of the capital agenda.
Thank you. And can I have a follow-up question there, Mr. Mayor?
Go ahead, Mr. Cassie.
You also mentioned on the Poplar Street, that $400,000, that's for the conduits and things like that between the bridge and Collins, is that right?
Mr. Mayor, Councilman Cathy, that is for the amenities that we wanted, the City of Casper wanted, that YDOT doesn't typically include in their scope. You know, with regard to highway projects that they complete. And so for us, that includes pathway connections, that includes lighting, you know, the decorative luminaires, that includes the sidewalk construction that was discussed quite thoroughly. That probably would have been in the previous calendar year. Mr. Beamer's on the phone, and he can tell us what else that might include that I might be missing, if that's okay, Mr. Mayor.
Mr. Beamer?
Well, because where my question comes in is I was thinking that to extend just on that one side of the bridge from the original 5 to 10, just that portion was like $450,000. And so that's where I'm trying to figure out how all these monies match together.
Mayor, Councilman, City Manager had it pretty accurate. We are spending some money to put decorative lights on the bridge deck. It is to widen the sidewalks on both sides of the bridge to 10 feet wide. It is pathway connections, and I'm not sure what the cost was exactly for that widening, but it was substantial. But we are leveraging that money with the enhancement money that YDOT also brings to the table to the tune of about $400,000 for that project.
Mr. Manager?
Thank you, Andrew. Do you mind discussing too the cost associated with the utility side of our responsibilities for that project? Just so everybody's clear on what the total spend on our part is.
Sure. We've also allocated close to $1.5 million in both water and sewer funds. We have a lift station for the sewer main that we have to relocate, and we've got some extensive water main replacement. We got a water main, well, actually both water and sewer strung to the underside of that bridge deck that we're going to have to replace as part of this project. So actually the utility work is a lot more extensive than the enhancement work for this project.
But both of those monies are coming from the respective enterprise funds. Is that correct?
Mayor, Councilman, that is correct.
Okay. So they're coming from rates and not sales tax money.
Mayor, Council, they're actually coming from the 1 cent allocation that you allocated towards both water and sewer. So in a sense, they are 1 cent money, but it was 1 cent money that was allocated to those facilities.
Okay, thank you.
Councilman Hopkins.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. I would only point out that council actually almost doubled the cost of what we were doing on the bridge over the river because we elected to put 10-foot wide right-of-ways on both sides of the river. And I'm not sure we need to do that. So that may be a place we could save some money. Thank you.
Councilman Huber.
Yeah, Mr. Mayor, thank you. I'd just like to go back to the City Hall project for a second and make sure that it's clear to everybody. As I understand it, Mr. Napier, the contract that we already entered into that you're saying we should go forward with, which I agree with, that's something that we will then still have the benefit of having those services already provided to us when and if it comes time that we follow through with any of these other enhancements on down the road. Am I understanding that correctly?
Mr. Manager.
Mr. Mayor, Councilman Huber, you are correct. The design will be what we can use and draw from immediately when the project is brought back online, and that of course can only happen when we feel comfortable that capital dollars are start to, have recovered and we feel comfortable taking on a larger project of that nature.
Okay, any other questions or comments? Okay. Did you want to segue into the next one then, or do you need something further on this one right now?
Looks like Councilman Cathy has a hand up.
Councilman Cathy, did you have something else?
Yes, part of the reason that I was asking about the bridge is I would like to reiterate Councilman Hopkins' comment about the money we're spending to put 10-foot walkways on that bridge as opposed to the 10 and the 5. So I think that's something we should look at long and hard.
Mr. Mayor, Councilman Cathy, what I would like to do is take that question under advisement a little bit, if I could, so that Andrew and I can talk a little further as to what that would involve, since much of that scope is already in design and is memorialized in the contract that we have with the state of Wyoming. I'm not saying that it can't be done or couldn't be considered or whatever, but I would like to do a little homework so that maybe for Wednesday night, if council wants to have a second installment of the budget meetings, this could be a topic that we could entertain if you so choose.
Okay, Councilman Powell.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. You know, I also salute you, Carter, for your efforts in making some very difficult calls here. You know, I think delaying projects like we are with the City Hall makes sense, especially if it's in design. The problem with scaling back on the walkways for me is once that concrete is poured, people are going to live with that decision for a long, long time, and there's no way to go back and add 5 feet. I remember an extensive discussion about how those 10-foot walkways would help with connectivity of the trail system, and we can't delay that project because it's not under our control. It's the state's project. So I just disagree with my fellow councilman. I realize that this is a good chunk of money, but I just short-sighted to scale back on it now when it's going to happen, and once it's done, we're stuck with the way it ends up.
Councilman Cathy.
I will wait and wait on the city manager and Andrews checking into the situation before I weigh back into this further. But you have heard my point, and we'll go from there. Because basically, Casper right now is fixing to lose people. I've lived here 30 years, and we haven't grown in population. And odds are, even if you brought something like Budweiser facility here, you're not going to double the population of this town in the next 50 years. So that's my feeling, and I don't see where when the rest of the pathway is only, 6 feet, 8 feet wide, why we need 2 10-footers across the bridge. But anyhow, that's, again, my 2 cents. Let's see what the city manager and our public works director have to say.
City manager.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. One of the other things I want to draw your attention to that would be a new piece to this, although it doesn't really, it's not necessarily a new project. On the spreadsheet that I'm looking at, this project is highlighted in orange for $100,000, and this is the clubhouse project. Council gave us a blessing to use Gulf Fund reserves to remodel, if you will, the clubhouse to try to get some more years out of it and to accommodate our new relationship with our new concessioner over there. Since the time that we have gotten into this project, the sprinkler system and its absence has really risen to the surface as being something that really needs to be paid attention to and looked at, particularly if we're going to have this building for the next 5 or so years, which is actually my hope that indeed these changes and improvements will get us through another 5 to 7 years without having to build a new facility. We do think that a sprinkler system is going to be needed for a fire suppression standpoint, and we are suggesting that for dollars, that some of the dollars that we have on hand, we dedicate towards that part of the project. The rest of it is coming out of golf course reserves. And I just want to make sure council is aware of that.
Okay.
Thank you.
All right, thank you. I don't think anybody else had, I can't see the rest of the screen, but I don't think anybody else has any further questions. There we go. All right, so we'll move on to social service agencies discussion. Mr. City Manager.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor, members of the council. I'm going to direct your attention to another spreadsheet. And again, I apologize that we just filled your inbox with spreadsheets, but we want to be sure you have the data that we're struggling with. Again, as I mentioned, part of the conversation with 1 cent 16, you have to consider and talk about the social service agencies, because many of these entities rely from an operational standpoint on these dollars coming to them, and certainly have important capital projects as well that they are hoping to fund with these 1 cent dollars. One of the critical elements of the contract that we have with them, however, recognizes the fact that there may be times in the funding cycle where the cash flow is interrupted and or in a much lower capacity than we originally anticipated. We certainly are in a period of time that we believe the cash flow for this funding stream is going to be incapacitated to some degree. We have suggested that the social service agency should look at their budgets through a 20% reduction type lens. Many of them have already told us what they think they can do and all those kinds of things. A number of them have had questions as it relates to projects and how that impacts their projects and so on. I want to be clear, we too have anticipated a 20% reduction in our sales tax dollars, and as you already know, we actually took a 60% reduction in the dollars that we plan to use for the same pot of money, for a lot of reasons and strategies that we hope will help us in the future. As you look at these numbers, please be aware we're not asking these entities to do anything that we're not trying to do ourselves as an organization. I am looking at the spreadsheet that is inclusive of the list of all of those entities, and as near as I can tell, that's 26 entities on the front page with 4 entities on the second page. It is blue across the top. I don't see a title on it, and so I hope that doesn't make it harder to look at. But if you'll look on your screen, we are sharing that with you right now, although I'm sure those numbers are hard to read on your screen. Our city clerk, Fleur, put this spreadsheet together, and you know, I'll probably rely upon her to walk us through some of the finer details of the spreadsheet. But what it basically tries to display is what it is that a 20% reduction would look like for each of our entities that we have partnerships with. For example, if you look at ARC of Natrona County, which is the very first entry on this spreadsheet, you will see that they were actually due for fiscal year 21 $11,666, which is, you know, a 25% allocation of their 4-year award. For fiscal year 21, however, with regard to a 20% discount or reduction, you will see that that operational figure for ARC of Natrona County drops to $9,333. We hope that in fiscal year 22, as you move across the spreadsheet there, those dollars can be rebounded to the amount that we originally anticipated per year. And in ARC's case, that would be $11,666. What I have tried to represent to our entities is that if indeed we see this discount being largely recovered in years 3 and 4, my representation to you would be that we would try to keep them whole and give them more than, again in ARC's case, $11,666 to try to make them whole by the end of the 4-year cycle. There is a possibility, as we are all aware, however, that we won't see the appropriate recovery in order to keep entities like ARC whole in our later years. But if we can, that'll certainly be what I advocate to all of you to try to make happen as those dollars come back and that cash flow is restored. But as you can tell, for a lot of these entities, we're not only talking about operational concerns, we are also talking about capital concerns. And Fleur, would you mind walking us through one of those entities that have that type of an issue?
Sure. So For example, on the next sheet, you'll see that we have the NIC, for example. They have some operational, most of theirs is capital, and so for theirs, we didn't reduce it by 20%. We instead gave them the cash at hand so they could finish out some of their capital projects. Are there others you want me to go over?
Mr. Mayor, another one that comes to mind for me would be the Platte River Trails Trust. They get a substantial amount of funding, much of which is with regard to their capital program, new extensions as well as repair of existing ones. We're proposing that they will see a reduction in not only what they anticipated for capital expenses, much of which would be included in that $151,000. They also have an operational component to this that is $50,000 a year, if I remember correctly, Fleur. Their 20% would drop their operational commitment to $40,000 a year. And much like the others that are taking these discounts, I would hope that by the end of the 4-year cycle, we could keep folks like the Platte River Trails Trust whole as well, with surplus payments in years 3 and 4, if we get that type of recovery to occur. So, Mr. Mayor, I guess my question generally or broadly is whether or not you agree with the assumptions that we're making here. And if so, then we will prepare our budgets accordingly. We'll try to get a letter out to each of the agencies along the lines of what we're talking about here tonight and confirming what we've kind of given them a potential preview for, and see if we can, you know, keep our fingers crossed that the cuts and reductions to our cash flow don't exceed 20% over the next year in this funding stream.
Okay. If we could, yeah, there we go. Okay, so does anybody have any questions or comments? Councilman Hopkins.
Comment. Quite honestly, we have lost as a country about 2.5 months of production, which is really about 8.33% per month, or 20.8%. And I think it's only fair that we all have to share what we can suffer, so to speak. And so, you know, a 2.5 month loss of production, I think everybody should share on this. And if you choose to give yourself and help these people out, I'm thinking we should do that. But we really have lost 2.5 months of production. And again, that's not counting what's going on in our oil and gas business, because that's going to last a lot longer. But I think we should just share it quasi-equally, if you will. Thank you.
Mr. Manager, I guess looking at this list, these were a lot of the people we talked to on our Zoom call, correct?
Yes.
And if I recall correctly in that conversation, they were, I mean, there's events that they raise their money for each year that they've lost out on also. So by taking a 20% reduction on these, I mean, do we foresee any of these? And I guess we won't know until we talk to them, but I mean, what kind of an impact? We're all seeing an impact from this, but those that relied on fundraisers that obviously couldn't happen, and now we're taking a 20% reduction, are we into a point where we may lose some of these services?
That's an excellent question, Mr. Mayor, and I sure as heck hope that that wouldn't be the case or the outcome. To date, I have not been told that that could be the case. And I would defer to the clerk, Madam Clerk, if you have heard anything along those lines.
So some of them brought it up in the call, and some of them I've spoken to after have mentioned that a lot of them have gone after the loans and the grants that are available due to the loss of their fundraisers. So a lot of them are utilizing that option to cover them because they do realize that they've lost out on fundraising dollars.
Okay, thank you. Any other questions or comments?
Mr. Mayor?
Councilman Cathy.
Councilman Hopkins has mentioned it a couple of times. Just to give you an idea of what's going on, back when things went hot in the oil business in 2015, it took oil prices back up over $50 for a period of time before you saw much activity return. Right now, WTI is at $24.57. This is as of yesterday morning. It's been in the $25 range now for about 7 days. Before that, it was below that. So that price has to double. Also, the thing that goes along with that is Wyoming Sweet, because of the deducts, is at $8.95. That's going to take a long time to get back up. Rockies gas is at $1.62. You have several of the oil companies now in the Powder River Basin have shut in production because they cannot continue to lose money on operation. One of my clients operates a saltwater disposal facility. It is no longer in operation because the operators have shut down production, so there's no water to dispose of. This, from the COVID-19, is not going to be the big driver for our tax money. We have been an oil and gas state for decades, and this is going to be as bad or worse than it was in 17. And if you recall in 17, Mr. Manager, you wound up putting a freeze on wages. Things were bad, and I cannot stress that enough, that probably short of a war someplace, our oil business is not going to improve for several years. And a lot of the projections I'm seeing are a year to 18 months before we're going to see much rise in oil prices. So I think that's something that everybody needs to try to start staying aware of as we proceed forward, that, our mainstream news media stresses COVID-19, but that's not what's going to be killing Wyoming and Casper's economy. I appreciate your time. Thank you.
Mr. Manager.
Mr. Mayor, thank you. And Councilman Cathy, thank you for your commentary there. One of the things that you might consider as a bright spot with respect to this particular phase of our budget conversation, the FTA really came to the plate with respect to funding public transportation. And fortunately, Casper was one of those lucky recipients of those dollars for this coming fiscal year, for our current fiscal year to some degree, and hopefully even for fiscal year 22 if everything works out like we think it might. Accordingly, some dollars have been made available that otherwise we would have spent on CATSI for not only operational support but for capital purchases as well. And so, those dollars are, at least a big portion of them, are potentially available for some of the emergent things that we might find ourselves needing to consider. Along those lines, we have we also have the difficult conversation of asking what it is that we should do with respect to our other partners who rely on 1 cent funding that we have kind of taken on from an operational standpoint in relationship with, and folks who we have relationships with that have other sources of funding that may possibly see shortages as well. So I guess what I'm doing is I'm priming the pump a little bit as it relates to this question needing to be continued, this conversation, into the week next week. To give you an example of what I'm talking about, I got a letter from Director Kinder, who has come into the public eye very frequently and aggressively here over the last couple months. And I think we put this in your packets. If not, we will this week, where she is suggesting that the health department will take a 5% deduction in the form of dollars that they will ask for from the city council, and I presume from the county commission as well. They are not funded through 1 cent 16. They are funded operationally through sales tax dollars that we would otherwise use for our operations. And in that scenario, those sales tax dollars are certainly ones that we are discounting from a projection standpoint by at least 20%. We can also talk about Advanced Casper. They are ones that get a $420,000 contribution from the city of Casper every year. In fairness to that relationship, those dollars do come from the power franchise that many of you have discussed at length over the years. We have not talked to them about a discount that they would like to offer, but in fairness to them, since we aren't talking about sales tax dollars, there's certainly a possibility that their discount doesn't need to be as deep as far as what council would consider, and we could work out with the Advanced Casper organization. I certainly believe that those who sit on that board probably have some feedback that would need to be considered in this conversation, and perhaps again, a conversation we can have next week, maybe even on Wednesday night if we can't cover it on our regular business meeting Tuesday evening, which I wouldn't expect that we would. Another agency we ought to consider is our relationship with the University of Wyoming for the extension services that we get. That very much is funded through 1 cent $16. And I would suggest, like their other colleagues that receive these kinds of dollars as well, they should consider a discount with respect to what it is that they receive. Certainly how much, that's obviously up to you and what it is we can work out with the university. But like many of you have already said, it is unclear to me how any entity really shouldn't be feeling some impact as it relates to trying to weather this very rough spot that we're facing and will likely face over the next 12 to 18 months.
Okay. Any other comments? All right, you need anything from us on this one here then?
Unless there aren't any other questions, Mr. Mayor, if council's largely comfortable with the major sort of concepts we have at this point moving forward, we'd like to get a letter out to our agency partners and let them know where we're at.
Everybody good with that? Yeah, it looks like we got thumbs up. Okay.
Thank you.
All right, thank you. We'll move on to agenda review. Mr. City Manager, you.
Mr. Mayor, the agenda for me that's most prevalent on my mind is next week's budget conversation. We actually have 2 days set aside for budget issues. Wednesday night being the primary delivery of the budget and its message and the major themes and so on. I believe we had a night set aside afterwards, which would be Thursday night, to go over any follow-up issues or other issues we just simply didn't get to cover in the previous evening. As it relates to the business meeting Tuesday night, the items that probably will require some discussion, I think, would include the ordinance conversation pertaining to alcohol management and so on. A lot of that we covered this evening. Covered containers on construction sites, and I believe we have the first reading of the health and safety issues pertaining to building maintenance as well. which all could include quite a bit of discussion potentially.
Councilman Kathy.
Yes. According to our calendar that Renee had sent out, we were supposed to have a budget meeting Monday night. Is that not happening?
Looks like that's the way it's set up.
I stand corrected, yes. Yeah.
Monday night, you'll have the budget session, Tuesday, the regular council meeting, followed by Wednesday night, another special work session.
Okay. The reason I was asking is Mr. Manager was talking, it sounded like we were missing Monday night. I just wanted to clarify that and make sure I had it all correct.
Monday sounds awful soon.
Right. It's only Tuesday. Okay, anybody have anything on agenda review they want to go over or any questions? Okay. All right, legislative review.
Mr. Mayor, for us, our attention is going to be dedicated to kind of following what happens with the special session. We've been in conversation quite regularly with WHAM, and they're doing a good job of keeping an eye on things and their ear to the ground, particularly as most of the municipalities are heavily engaged in trying to pass budgets with their respective councils. And so I think the biggest concern for us will be whether or not we get to take advantage of any of those federal dollars that have been allocated to the state. At this point, it's not looking really good, except from a reimbursement standpoint for some of the very direct costs that we incurred dealing with COVID-19 management. Otherwise, I don't see much help as it relates to revenue backfill and those kinds of things, at least coming out of this week's conversation.
Okay, Councilman Hopkins.
But do we think we're going to get a link to at least listen in? We don't get to participate, obviously, but are we going to get a link to listen in, do you think? Does anybody have any feedback on that?
Mr. Mayor, that is my understanding, and we would be happy to forward that along once we get our hands on it.
Thank you.
Okay. Councilman Powell?
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Just two things. I hope you all had a chance to look at Justin Schilling's description of WHAM's efforts on our behalf as far as advocating for municipalities. I think this is another example of how it's very difficult for us to operate independently, and we rely upon a statewide organization to speak for us and to speak with the voice of all the 99 municipalities. So for those of you who question the value of WHAM, I think if you look at that letter, you'll again see that this is an organization that's really working on our behalf. Next week at 10 o'clock is a WHAM board meeting that will be happening online, of course. And I believe that will be the first serious discussion of resolutions that are being in the process of being developed. And we'll see how much traction the proposals that we have made will get next Thursday. And I'll be representing us at that meeting.
Okay. Anything else on legislative review? No? Okay. We'll do council around the table then. Let's start with Councilman Powell.
Nothing this evening, Mr. Mayor.
Okay, thank you. Councilman Hopkins?
Oh, can't
hear you, Bob.
All I can say is that you guys did a great job tonight, and thanks for all your efforts to make electric meetings work.
Electric meetings. Thanks. Yeah, Councilman Kathy.
Yes, the only thing I was interested in, does anybody have any feeling, and I realized it would take a little bit longer, but for the letter that I'm sure we all got from Dan Harkin about his tax bill. Does anybody know what I'm talking about?
Go ahead, Mr.
What
Manager.
it boils down to. Go ahead, Mr. Mayor.
Mr. Manager, go ahead.
Mr. Mayor and members of the council, that the letter that Councilman Cathy is referring to, we have included in previous information packets that suggests, from his perspective, that he was unfairly charged for late fees and other penalties that he incurred for non-payment of his LED assessment there in the Fort Casper neighborhood a number of years ago. So his bottom line is he wants to contend the incurrence of those additional fees. I think he's prepared to pay and may have already paid, actually. As I sit here, I don't totally know or remember his principal that he owes. And Mr. Mayor, unless you remember otherwise, that's what I recall about the issue.
Yeah. Councilman Cathy.
Mr. Mayor, Mr. Manny.
Frozen.
Councilman Cathy, you still there?
I think there's a problem with electricity.
Thing, but Mr. Pad chose not to write a letter to us and took it to small claims court and lost. So basically, he had to pay all of it. And we as council, now that he has written that letter, we have to make a decision as to, does he pay it all, does he pay none of it, or where? And I figure it's time to get this off our plate. And I guess I would make a suggestion that we split the difference with him and he pays half of the penalty and we forego half of it. But that's my suggestion.
Mr. Manager, can we just make sure everybody gets brought back up to speed on this before we make any kind of a decision, just to make sure everybody has all the facts, and then I guess we can come back and make a collective decision unless something has to be done right away.
Mr. Mayor, that would be just fine. And as a matter of fact, this could be something that we could conclude potentially on in pre-meeting next week. And in that meantime, we'll be sure to get that letter back out to you so people can brush up on the matter, and I'll try to determine what in fact he has paid compared to what is outstanding.
Okay. Councilman Cathy, you have anything else?
That was all I had at this point. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Councilman Johnson? No? Okay. Councilman Huber?
I've talked enough tonight.
Councilman Pacheco?
I just want to, I know it's been kind of a difficult couple of weeks with all the stuff going on. Just wanted again to say thank you to the hard work that the mayor and vice mayor and have been putting in. I know it's not been easy. A lot of the criticism that they have been taking, we need to continue to support them. We can disagree on certain things, but I think it's critical that we support them as we kind of go through this, and I just want to continue to reiterate that and be a unified council, which I do think we are, but I think we just need to continue to do that, but say thank you to them and continued thanks to the city employees for their hard work during this difficult time too. So thanks everyone.
Thank you. Councilman Bates?
Thank you. Councilman Bates. Thank you, Mayor. Regarding the gentleman that Councilman Cathy talked about, I did meet with him,
And I do have the receipt that he showed that he did pay the principal. He has the receipt, and I've talked to him about the suggestion that was sent from Carter on our weekly updates a week or two ago. And from the sounds of it, he seems that he's good with that as well. So, and I know everybody will get update on it, but I've been in contact with him and talked to him about it. And he's shown all the documentation and everything. So I hope council will truly look at splitting the difference with this guy. I totally agree with Councilman Kathy on that. The other thing that I have is if you guys hopefully have seen that Grand Street Grocery was considered with the historical preservation as preservation of the month, celebrating it as the preservation of the month. And if you haven't been to the virtual tour, I ask that you guys go to the www.historicalwyoming.org and take a look at that virtual that's supposed to have been out today. And we talked to, so I just hope that you guys look at that. Also talking with, or being on video conference early with historical preservation. What was the other thing? Oh, that they talked about with Wells Fargo, the drive-through that they are looking at tearing that out and putting in a new Wells Fargo building right there. So that's kind of exciting that they're looking at still keeping within Casper even through all this. So that's exciting. But there's no conversation about the White Tower or the building next to it. They call the egg beater building, what they're going to do with that. So just wanted to let you know what they talked about, historical preservation, and that's it.
But, Councilman Powell.
Mayor, I'm sorry to interrupt, but I forgot to mention something. We all got an email from Jesse Morgan inviting us to tour his property Friday. It might be worthwhile to see how many people want to do that, and if we could agree on a time so he wouldn't have to give 5 different tours. I was going to do one of them, but it didn't matter to me. Is anyone else interested in seeing this? Because it is controversial what's going on over there.
Anybody?
Apparently not. Okay. I'll take a look at it and I'll give you guys a report.
Thank you, Charlie.
Vice Mayor Lutz.
Nothing tonight.
And I don't have anything to add either. So thanks for all the hard work, and I guess that's the end of the meeting. Oh, Councilman Bates.
I don't know if you can speak on this, Mayor, but there's rumor that has it we will be meeting possibly at City Hall starting sometime in June. Can you elaborate on that at all?
I can't. City Manager.
Mr. Mayor, Councilman Bates, I appreciate the question actually because it gives me an opportunity to plug our what we call the reopening plan for the city facilities, and I will be sure to make it clear in that plan what we would envision at least as a proposal for all of you to consider. But at this point, you know, I hadn't really come up with a date as it relates to when I'd feel comfortable opening City Hall or what I'd recommend to you or anything like that.
So we don't have any dates right now for reopening city services, though. Or like City Hall.
City Hall, right?
Yeah.
No.
Okay. Okay. Anybody else have anything else? Okay. Thanks, and have a good night.
Thanks, everybody.